Wenningfold near York, the 17th of December, 1819, 5:30 at the parsonage parlour. 2 years to the day. I write this only for myself, in the green marbled book of my late mother, who would have known how to bear it better than I have, and who would not, I suppose, have written it down. I write because the small, steady hand of the moving pen is the better friend at the dawn of the 17th of December than the candle's silence. It had begun to sleet at the 4 o'clock hour of the afternoon of Wednesday 17th December 1817. By the 9 o'clock hour of that night, the moor above Stainforth Hall lay under 3 inches of unbroken sleet over the Skipton Road. The great hall fire had been banked at 8:30. The household had withdrawn to their offices. The South Library had been shuttered for the night by Mr. Lockstone at the customary 9:30. The Duke of Stainforth, my husband of 17 months and 4 days, called me out into the great hall at the 9:30. He stood at the south door, in his unadorned dark grey travelling coat over his evening dress, the south door open behind him, the sleet driving past his left shoulder. He had with him in his right hand the slanderous letter of his cousin Sir Octavian, and the slanderous testimony of Captain Wycombe of the 33rd. He had not seen my face in the candlelight of the hall till he had nearly finished what he had to say. He asked me, in the candid, sober voice of a husband convicted of a wife's infidelity, to leave Stainforth Hall by the 10:30 and never to return. I did not, at the 9:30 of that Wednesday night, tell him that I was carrying his heir of 3 months and 1 week. I did not tell him, because I had not, in the 4 sober minutes he had given me at the south door, the means to make the telling believed. I went up to my chamber. Bessie the undermaid packed my small linen case. At 10:15 I came down. I went out at the south door at the 10:30 exactly. The sleet was thick. I walked the 7 miles to the Skipton Road, where the mail coach passed at the 11 o'clock hour of every night, and at the 11 I took the seat to York, at the 4 shillings my late mother's locket from beneath my bodice paid the driver. I have not, in the 2 years since, returned to Stainforth Hall. My son, who has now lately turned 18 months, sleeps upstairs at the parsonage in the north-east chamber. He is named Caspian Halifax Marchmont, after his father the Duke and his father's father the 4th Duke. He was baptised on the 28th of June 1818 at St. Mark's by the Reverend Bramwell as Master Caspian Templeton Carr, in my own maiden name, his father not having been informed of his birth. And this morning, by the 7 o'clock post, the small Stainforth sealed letter has come up to me, in the candid copperplate hand of the Duke of Stainforth, my husband. A.M. T.C. The green marbled commonplace book was closed at the writing table, the entry blotted, and the pen laid sober across the rim of the brass inkwell. Lady Adelaide Marchmont, 5th Duchess of Stainforth, known at Wenningfold for 2 years as Miss Adelaide Carr, sat at the writing table in the dawn light, tall, slim, 5'7" upright, in her unadorned dove-grey wool morning gown with the clean white linen collar, her soft, mid-blonde hair pinned smooth at the nape under a sober dark cap, her candid sea-green eyes very direct upon the brass salver at her elbow. The letter lay in the salver beside the candle, the Stainforth wax with its falcon over a sheaf of barley cracked at the seam where the paper-knife had passed through it at the 4:30. Below the parlour, in the kitchen, the kettle had begun to sing upon the range, and Miss Tabitha Carr, having heard her niece come down by the back stair at the 4:30, was at the range with the tea canister and the milk jug in her usual unruffled way. 2 years, very nearly to the hour, had passed at the parsonage. Adelaide had come up to Wenningfold on the morning of the 18th of December, 1817, having taken the 11 o'clock mail coach from the Skipton Road to York, and the 7 o'clock York to Tadcaster coach to the Wenningfold crossroads, where she had walked the half-mile from the crossroads to the parsonage gate by the parish lane in the grey first light. Her aunt, Miss Tabitha Carr, 61 then, with iron grey hair beneath a clean white linen cap, sensible hazel eyes very direct, slender 5'5" upright in her unadorned dove-grey serge with the clean white lawn fichu, had opened the parsonage door at 7:30 and had taken her niece in candidly, without a word of question. The cousinly fiction by which the village should know her had been constructed at the parsonage hearth that evening, between the two of them, over the dish of tea Miss Tabitha had brewed. That Miss Adelaide Carr was the late Reverend Carr's young niece, lately come up from Northumberland, widowed of her army officer husband at the field of Quatre Bras, and that she would remain at the parsonage with her aunt for so long as the house should hold the both of them. Master Caspian Halifax had been born at the parsonage on the 4 o'clock hour of the morning of the 24th of June, 1818, with the village midwife, Mrs. Bywater, and Miss Tabitha at the bedside. He had been baptised on the 28th of June at St. Mark's by Reverend Bramwell as Master Caspian Templeton Carr in his mother's maiden name, the Reverend Bramwell having looked once at his Duchess, whom he did not at that hour know to be a Duchess, and once at Miss Tabitha, and having asked no questions whatever, and having entered the baptism by the regular Yorkshire parish hand at the customary page of the St. Mark's Register. By the customary arrangement of the Reverend Bramwell from November 1818, Adelaide had given the parish reading class to 7 village girls at £8 a year, the lessons held at the parsonage parlour on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons from 2 until 4, with Miss Tabitha presiding at her sewing in the corner. Her late mother's quarterly allowance of £40 from the Templeton Carr Trust, paid by Mr. Pettifer of York under the cousinly fiction of Miss Adelaide Carr, had gone into Mr. Wheatcroft's bank at York at the regular quarter days, and from that account Adelaide had drawn the household keeping for herself and her son. The village had perceived no alteration in their second cousin Miss Carr, and had received her with the usual amiable Yorkshire civility, and had asked no further question than was sensible. The 2 previous Stainforth sealed letters arrived at the 7 o'clock post of Sunday the 12th, and at the 7 o'clock post of Tuesday the 14th. Adelaide had returned, unopened, by the carrier of the same morning, with no answer beyond the unbroken seal returned upon the back. The 3rd letter arrived at the 7 o'clock post of this Friday the 17th, the 2nd anniversary of the South Door storm. She had carried up to the parsonage parlour from the kitchen at the 4:30, and had set in the brass salver beside the candle at the writing-table, and had looked at, in the candlelight, for the full quarter of an hour, before she had taken the paper-knife to the wax at the seam. She had read the letter through once between the 4:30 and the 5 o'clock. She had then taken her late mother's green-marbled commonplace book from the writing-table drawer, and had written the entry which now stood upon the open page. Adelaide, in her unadorned dove-grey wool morning gown at the upright Yorkshire writing-chair, took the Duke's letter from the brass salver a second time, and unfolded it upon the writing-table at her left hand, and read it again at the candle. The letter was upon a single sheet of stout cream paper of the customary Stainforth size, written in the deliberate, copper-plate hand of her husband, in the brown-black ink, which she had once known at the South Library writing-table at Stainforth Hall. It ran thus: The Black Swan Inn, York, the 16th of December, 1819, 9:30 at the writing-table of the upper chamber. My dear Duchess, I write to you at this hour at the upper chamber of the Black Swan at York, because I have not, in the 2 years and a day, since the storm night of the 17th of December, 1817, written to you anything to which I should have asked you to set your hand, and because I have at the present writing-table no other means by which to make the asking. I have learned, at the 2nd week of October last, by the candid grace of my sister Lady Eugenia, who at White's overheard my cousin Sir Octavian boast at the cribbage table to a captain of foot lately come up from Lisbon of the false letter, and the bribed witness by which my cousin had, at the autumn of 1817, brought me to the conviction which I, to my mortal shame, accepted at the south door of Stainforth Hall. I have, since that hour, consulted Mr. Stanger at Lincoln's Inn. I have read at Mr. Stanger's chambers the witness affidavits of 3 Stainforth servants who, in the autumn of 1817, saw my cousin forge the letter and tutor the witness, and I have received at Stainforth Hall, sent under safe conduct from Lisbon in the 2nd week of November, the letter of Captain Wykeham of the 33rd, in candid confession of the part which he, by my cousin's bribe, was prevailed upon to play in the slander. I have been a fool, my Duchess, for the 2 years entire of your absence from my house, and have no defence to offer beyond that I shall offer in person at any hour you will appoint. I believe, by my sister Lady Eugenia's separate inquiry at the agency of Mrs. Tetlow, now my housekeeper at Stainforth Hall, that you have remained at Wenningfold near York, at the parsonage of your aunt Miss Carr, through these 2 years entire. I shall, if you will receive me, call at the parsonage at 3 o'clock on the Sunday following, that is, the 19th of December, to ask your forgiveness, on whatever terms you shall name, and at whatever time you shall require, with Miss Carr present throughout, if you should desire her to be so. I am, my dear Duchess, your most contrite and obedient servant, Stainforth. Adelaide read the letter through a second time at the candle, deliberate at the lines, without the lifting of her hand from the rim of the writing-table. At the close, she folded the letter once at the original middle crease and laid it sober beside the salver. She did not weep. She had not wept at the parsonage parlour writing-table since the spring of 1818, when the news of her late father's death had come up by the Pettifer post, and she did not weep now. She remained at the writing-chair until the kettle below stairs had ceased to sing, and the kitchen had grown quiet, and then she lifted the candle and trimmed the wick at the candle-trimmer, and the dawn beyond the parlour window had begun to lighten at the upper sash to the pale blue of a Yorkshire December morning. At the 6:30 exactly, the parlour door was opened by Miss Tabitha Carr, who came in with the dish of tea on the japanned tray and set it without observation upon the corner of the writing-table at her niece's elbow. She had on her unadorned dove-grey serge morning gown with the clean white lawn fichu and the clean white linen cap, and her sensible hazel eyes were as candid as on every morning of the 2 years entire. She looked at her niece in the dawn light at the writing-table. She looked at the green marbled book closed beside the inkwell. She looked at the folded letter at the brass salver. She did not inquire. She sat down at the upright Yorkshire chair on the further side of the writing-table and took up the dish of tea by the saucer and waited. Adelaide, candidly, after a thoughtful pause, lifted the folded letter from the salver and put it across the writing-table to her aunt. Aunt Tabitha, will you read it? It came up at the 7 of yesterday morning. I had returned the 2 previous unopened, as you know. This one I have opened at the 4:30. Miss Tabitha set down the dish of tea upon the saucer, and took the letter from her niece's hand without remark, and unfolded it upon the writing-table, and read it through at the candle in unruffled gravity, deliberate at the lines, her hazel eyes moving without alteration from the salutation to the signature. She read it once. She read it a second time. She folded it again at the original middle crease, and laid it across the writing-table to her niece. She remarked candidly, after the thoughtful pause, "My dear Adelaide, you shall do as you see proper. I shall be at the parsonage parlour with you on the Sunday afternoon at 3, if you receive him." Adelaide returned, candidly, in the unruffled, sober voice she had brought down from the south door storm, and had kept for the 2 years entire at the parsonage hearth. "Aunt Tabitha, I shall receive him at 3 on the Sunday." Miss Tabitha inclined her cap once at her niece across the writing-table, took up the dish of tea again, and drank it through without further observation, and presently rose and removed herself to the kitchen below, leaving Adelaide at the writing table at the candle with the folded letter and the green marbled commonplace book at her right hand and the dawn brightening at the upper sash beyond. Adelaide took up the pen again and a fresh half-sheet of the parsonage household paper from the writing table drawer, and wrote out at the candle her unadorned, candid reply in the deliberate italic hand which her late mother had taught her at the schoolroom at Carrowby in the year 1806. The reply ran to a single paragraph upon the half-sheet. She acknowledged the receipt of the Duke's letter of the 16th of December at the 7 o'clock post of the morning. She informed him that she would receive him at the parsonage parlour at Wenningfold at 3 o'clock on the afternoon of Sunday the 19th of December. She informed him that Miss Carr would be present at the parsonage parlour throughout the call. She subscribed herself simply, in the candid, sober hand, A.M.T.C. She folded the half-sheet at the customary middle crease, wrote the direction to the Black Swan Inn at York, melted a drop of red household wax at the candle, and impressed it with her late mother's Templeton Carr signet. Not the Stainforth seal which lay these 2 years in the locked tortoiseshell box at the top drawer of the writing table. And, at the 10:30, by the parish boy, Tom Stockdale, who came up from the village at the usual Friday morning hour for the parsonage commissions, she sent the reply down by the carrier's gig that ran on the 11:30 to York. Tom Stockdale, a sensible boy of 14 in his unadorned brown jacket, took the half-sheet candidly upon his palm, inclined his cap at the door, and went down the parish lane at the gate at the gracious, unhurried walk of his usual errand. Adelaide, the reply gone, returned to the parlour writing table, set the candle out at the candle snuffer, and laid the green marbled commonplace book in the writing table drawer beside the locked tortoiseshell box. She closed the drawer. She went up to the north-east chamber at the top of the parsonage stair at the 11 o'clock hour to look in upon her son, who slept yet at the cradle by the chimney-piece, and at the door she paused once and looked at the candid, fair-haired, sleeping face of him, and went down again to the parlour. The Friday morning passed in the customary work of the parlour, the mending of 2 parish girls' pinafores for the reading class of the following Tuesday, the writing out of the lesson text from Mrs. Trimmer's reader, the household account book, balanced at the columns of the week. At the 1:30, the parsonage dinner was taken at the parlour table. Cold ham, the remains of the Tuesday loaf, the apple tart from the Thursday. Adelaide and Miss Tabitha at the upright Yorkshire chairs upon either side, with Master Caspian Halifax sleeping upstairs at his after-dinner nap. At the 2:30 of the Friday afternoon, Master Caspian Halifax woke from his nap, and Sally Goff, the housemaid, a sensible girl of 17 with kind blue eyes in her clean white cap and apron, brought him down to the parlour upon her hip, and set him upon the hearth-rug at his mother's feet. He was 18 months and 3 weeks in his unadorned cream linen long petticoats with the clean white pinafore over, his pale blonde fine hair, lately come in waves at the temples, his candid dark jade eyes, very direct upon his mother. Adelaide took down from the parsonage bookshelf the cloth-bound copy of The Children of the Abbey her aunt had set out for the village reading class, and sat upon the hearth-rug beside her son, and opened the book at the engraved frontispiece for him. He could not at this age read the text, nor would it have answered to him if she had read it, but he liked very well the engravings, of which there were 6 in the volume, and he sat at her side at the candid hour of the warm parsonage fire, and put his finger to the engravings as she turned the pages. He called her, when he reached for her hand at the engraving of the Abbey gate, "Mamma!" in the deliberate manner of his 18-month speech, and at the engraving of the little dog at the gatekeeper's lodge, he ventured for her, in a candid, sober new pronunciation she had not heard from him before, his only new word of the present month, book. Adelaide returned, gracious at the hearth-rug. "Yes, my dear, book." Sally Goff in the corner with her sewing inclined her cap once at her mistress, gratified, and went on with her hem. Miss Tabitha, at the upright chair by the parlour window with her own sewing, observed the new word without remark, and let down a single careful stitch in her unruffled way, and looked across the parlour at her niece and her great-nephew upon the hearthrug at the warm fire without further observation. At the 5:30, Master Caspian Halifax was taken back up to the north-east chamber by Sally Goff for his bread and milk and his early sleep, and was settled at the cradle by the chimney-piece at the customary 6:30. The parsonage tea was taken at the parlour table at the 7, Adelaide and Miss Tabitha at the upright Yorkshire chairs. The dish of tea, the parsonage bread, the apple butter from the Michaelmas store. Neither aunt nor niece resumed the subject of the letter, which had been settled at the writing table at the 6:30 and required no further discussion. At the 8:30 of the Friday evening, the parsonage parlour was settled at the customary aunt and niece hour of the winter night. Master Caspian Halifax was asleep upstairs in the north-east chamber. Adelaide was at the parsonage hearth in her unadorned dove-grey wool morning gown, with the clean white lawn fichu at the throat, upright at the further Yorkshire chair by the fire, with her own sewing, the hemming of a new white pinafore for her son, at her lap. The green-marbled commonplace book lay closed at the writing-table drawer, where she had laid it at the 11 of the morning. The kitchen range below had been banked for the night by Miss Tabitha and Sally Goff at the 7:30. Miss Tabitha, in her unadorned dove-grey serge with the clean white lawn fichu, was at the corner Yorkshire chair on the further side of the hearth with her own sewing. The darning of a parish girl's stocking for the Tuesday reading class. Neither spoke. The candid, sober Yorkshire winter night closed at the parsonage parlour without further event. The fire at its red glow at the grate, the candle trimmed at the mantel-shelf, the clock at the parlour wall, ticking off at the customary hour the quiet, measured minutes of the 2 years that had brought Adelaide Marchmont, 5th Duchess of Stainforth, by a road she had walked at the 10:30 of a Wednesday storm night, to this Friday evening of the 17th of December, 1819, when, at 3 o'clock of the Sunday following, she would receive her husband at the parsonage parlour for the first time in 2 years and 2 days, and would hear from his own lips, with Miss Tabitha Carr at her corner with her sewing, what she had at the writing-table at the dawn already read in his deliberate copper-plate hand. The Sunday morning of the 19th of December, 1819, opened at Wenningfold near York at the cold pale blue hour of 7:30, with the parsonage chimney drawing its first thread of wood smoke into the unmoving Yorkshire air. Adelaide rose at 6:30. She nursed Master Caspian Halifax at the north-east nursery at 7, by the established arrangement of the 18 months of his suckling, and laid him afterwards in the cradle at his second sleep. She came down at the 8:15 in her Sunday gown, unadorned dove-grey wool with the clean white lawn fichu pinned at the throat, her soft mid-blonde hair pinned smooth at the nape under the sober dark cap she wore at the parish church, and took the morning chocolate with Miss Tabitha, who was already in her Sunday gown of unadorned dove-grey serge with the white lawn fichu. They spoke, in the customary unruffled way of the parsonage hearth, of the reading class for the Tuesday following, and of the seed cake which Sally Goff had set in the oven for the tea hour of the afternoon. At 9:30, Sally brought down Master Caspian Halifax in his Sunday infant coat of cream wool with the unadorned bone buttons, his pale blonde fine hair brushed smooth at the crown, his candid dark jade eyes wide with the bell. Adelaide took him on her hip. Miss Tabitha drew on her dark mantle. Sally, 18, judicious, fair-haired beneath her clean white linen cap, carried the prayer-book and the warming-stone. The 3 of them went out at the parsonage gate at the 20 minutes to 10 and walked the 3 lengths of the parish lane to St. Mark's between the unmoving hedges of leafless blackthorn. The Reverend Bramwell met them at the south porch in his unadorned black cassock and clean white linen surplice, his soft white hair finely thinning at the crown, his sensible grey eyes behind the gold-rimmed spectacles, candid as on every Sunday of the 2 years entire. He inclined at Miss Tabitha, inclined at Adelaide, laid his fine old hand for a moment upon the crown of the child, and bid the 3 of them in to the rectory pew at the 2nd row of the south aisle. The Advent 4 service began at 10:30 by the church clock. Sally Goff took the pew immediately behind. The villagers, the Wenningfold farmers in their Sunday smocks, the carrier Mr. Wheatley and his sober wife, the 4 Bywater families at the middle pews, the parish schoolmaster Mr. Linnell at the rear, looked once at the rectory pew at the entry of Miss Carr and her aunt and the child, as they had looked at every Sunday for the 2 years entire, and inclined gravely and turned again to the reading desk. They perceived no alteration whatever in their second cousin Miss Carr. She was what she had been at every Sunday. The late Reverend Carr's young niece, widowed of her army officer husband at Quatre Bras, judicious at the pew with her infant son on her aunt's lap, and her own gloved hands folded at the prayer book. The Reverend Bramwell read the Advent 4 collect in his gentle Yorkshire voice, that the Lord should raise up his power and come among them. Adelaide stood at the Magnificat in unruffled gravity, her candid sea-green eyes upon the open prayer book. At the lesson, Philippians the 4th, the Lord is at hand, she lifted her eyes once to the south window, where the pale December sun had begun to come through the leaded glass, and lowered them again at the verse. Master Caspian Halifax slept at his aunt's lap through the sermon and woke at the closing hymn. At 11:30, the Reverend Bramwell pronounced the blessing. At the 25 minutes to 12, the parsonage party walked back the parish lane to the gate. The village did not know that the Duke of Stainforth was at the upper chamber of the Black Swan Inn at York, 7 miles to the east, taking his morning chocolate with his butler Mr. Lockstone at the door, and the hired York post-chaise at the inn-yard, and the leather portfolio at the writing-table at his elbow. The village walked home to its Sunday dinner, the parsonage closed its gate, and Adelaide carried her son in at the front door at the 20 minutes to 12. The cold dinner was set at the parlour table at 1, cold mutton, parsonage bread, Wenningfold pickled red cabbage, stewed pear from the orchard. Miss Tabitha said, "The grace." Adelaide ate without remark, Master Caspian Halifax upon her lap. At 1:30, Sally cleared the table. At the 1:45, she carried the child upstairs to the nursery for his afternoon sleep, with the warming stone in the dishcloth at the foot of the cradle and the door pulled to, but not latched. At 2:30, the preparations for the 3 o'clock hour were as candid as for any of the 7 o'clock teas of the parsonage week. Adelaide had not altered the cap or the gown. The dove-grey wool was that of the morning service. The white lawn fichu had not been changed. The dark cap at the nape was the same she wore at the village reading class on the Tuesday afternoons. Miss Tabitha was in her own unadorned dove-grey serge with the white lawn fichu, judicious at her sewing frame. The parlour fire had been built up at 2, with 3 fresh ash logs from the woodshed. The Bywater oak parlour table, drawn from the south window to the centre of the rug, was laid for tea at the Sunday hour with the clean white linen cloth Miss Tabitha kept for parish visit afternoons. The Carr-Brown earthenware teapot, the late Reverend Carr's own from his cottage at Lincolnshire, sat in the warming corner. The Wenningfold blue and white parish plate of seed cake, Sally's, baked at the kitchen range that morning, sat at the centre of the cloth, the slices ranged in unruffled order. The 4 dishes, the 4 saucers, the 4 spoons of the late Lady Mehitabel's unadorned silver, the milk jug and the sugar basin, were laid at the 4 sides. At 2:45, Adelaide sat at the upright Yorkshire chair at the south side of the parlour table, her hands folded at the rim of the linen cloth, and Miss Tabitha at the corner chair, her sewing frame at her knee. Neither spoke. The clock struck the 3/4. The parsonage cat, Mrs. Beck, a soft grey of the village, lay at the rug at the hearth. The fire moved at a sedate red without sound. The afternoon beyond the window was pale and unmoving at the leafless branches of the parsonage rowan. At 3 o'clock exactly the hired York post-chaise drew up at the parsonage gate. The wheels at the frost of the parish lane sounded twice and ceased. There was the sound of the off-side door being opened by the postboy, and immediately after of the rumble being opened and of a man dismounting at the gate. Adelaide did not rise. Miss Tabitha did not raise her eyes from the sewing frame. The clock struck 3. The man who dismounted from the rumble was Mr. Lockstone, the Stainforth butler of 35 years at the house, 63, 6 foot upright thin, white hair brushed back at the nape under the customary black travelling hat, kind grey eyes very direct in his unadorned black butler's tailcoat with the worn silver Stainforth buttons. He had come down at his master's particular request from the upper chamber of the Black Swan that morning. Mr. Lockstone had not seen Adelaide in 2 years and 2 days entire, not since the 9:30 of the storm night at the south door of Stainforth Hall, and he had not, in the 2 years entire, forgiven his master in his own unspoken Yorkshire manner. He stood at the gate, his hat in his right hand at his thigh, and inclined deeply at the parsonage door in the candid, sober Stainforth inclination of the upper hall. The Duke of Stainforth descended from the chaise at 3:03. He was in his unadorned dark walnut travelling coat over the unadorned buff waistcoat, with the small silver buttons of the late 4th Duke's own pattern, the buff breeches, the brown-topped boots, the white cravat, 6'2", lean upright, the dark walnut hair cut close at the nape, with the 2 threads of pure silver above the right temple, which had lately come of grief, the deliberate dark jade eyes candid at the door. He took up the leather portfolio from the chaise seat. He inclined once at Mr. Lockstone. He walked the 7 paces of the flagged path between the dormant lavender to the front door, Mr. Lockstone following at 3 paces. The front door was opened by Sally Goff at the half-rap of the brass falcon-headed knocker. She inclined gravely and stood aside at the threshold without remark, as Adelaide had instructed her. Mr. Lockstone remained at the hall, his hat at his thigh, by his own particular wish. He would not, he had said to his master at the 9:45, presume upon the parlour. Sally drew the parlour door open. The Duke entered the parsonage parlour at 3:04. Miss Tabitha rose from the corner chair, the sewing frame laid aside upon the seat, and met him at the centre of the rug, with her hands folded candidly at her waist. She inclined her grey head once. "My lord, you are welcome at the parsonage at Wenningfold." The Duke inclined deeply at Miss Tabitha, the Stainforth inclination of the upper hall, deliberate at the close, and inclined deeper at Adelaide at the upright Yorkshire chair at the parlour table. He did not, in the 4 candid seconds it took him to come up to the table, lift his eyes from his wife's gloved hands folded upon the rim of the linen cloth. He had not seen her face in the 2 years and 2 days entire. He stopped at the further side of the parlour table, set the leather portfolio at his right hand upon the edge of the cloth, and waited at his Duchess's pleasure. "Be seated, Stainforth," remarked Adelaide, candidly, in the unruffled, sober voice she had brought down from the south door storm and had kept for the 2 years entire at the parsonage hearth. She did not lift her hands from the rim of the parlour table. She did not lift her sea-green eyes above his cravat. "Aunt Tabitha shall pour." Miss Tabitha returned to the corner, took up the brown earthenware teapot from the warming corner, and poured the 3 dishes of tea at the customary parsonage interval. First the Duke's at his right hand, then Adelaide's at the south side, then her own. She set the milk jug at the centre of the cloth and the sugar basin beside it. She returned to her chair, took up the sewing frame, and resumed her work at the unruffled, candid pace of the 18 months entire. Her hazel eyes upon the linen at her hands and not upon the parlour table. The Duke seated himself at the further side, opposite his wife. The leather portfolio sat at his right hand. The 2-year storm sat between them at the parlour table. He did not, at the first minute, lift the dish of tea. He waited until Adelaide had lifted her own at the saucer and had set it again without sipping. Then he spoke, candidly, deliberate at the lines, in the deep, sober voice of the South Library writing table. Adelaide, I shall be brief at the openings, and you shall have whatever time you require at the close. I have read, at the chambers of Mr. Stanger at Lincoln's Inn, on the 30th of November last, Sir Octavian's affidavit extraction, taken at Mr. Stanger's own hand from the cribbage table boast of the 2nd week of October. I have read at the same chambers the affidavits of 3 Stainforth servants, Mr. Lockstone, Mrs. Tetlow, and the upper footman Tom Hardacre, who saw my cousin at the autumn of 1817 forge the letter and tutor the witness. I have received at the same chambers, on the 22nd of November, Captain Wycombe's letter of the 28th of October from Lisbon, in candid confession of the part which he, by my cousin's bribe of 200 guineas, was prevailed upon to play. I have them all here, at the leather portfolio at my elbow, in the order Mr. Stanger advised, with his covering note at the front, and his summary at the back. I have brought them down for you to read. He laid his right hand upon the portfolio for a moment, and lifted it again, and set the portfolio at the centre of the linen cloth. I am asking you, Adelaide, to read them at your own pace, and to take whatever stillness you require. I shall not speak until you have laid them down. Adelaide inclined her head once. She drew the portfolio across the cloth to her own side with her gloved hand at the spine. She loosed the brass clasp at the customary fastening. She lifted the cover. She read. She read for the better part of the hour. Mr. Stanger's covering note first, deliberate at the lines. Then the affidavit of Mr. Lockstone of the 7th of October, sworn at York at the office of Sir Marmaduke Garforth at the bench of the West Riding. Then Mrs. Tetlow's of the same date and bench. Then Tom Hardacre's of the 8th of October, sworn at the same bench. Then the candid extraction of Sir Octavian's October boast taken at Mr. Stanger's hand in Lady Eugenia's parlour at Cavendish Square, signed by Lady Eugenia and witnessed by Sir Wilfrid Beaufort. Then Captain Wycombe's confession from Lisbon, in the candid hand of an officer at the close of his career, dated under safe conduct at the Rua do Alecrim. She did not weep. She did not lift her eyes from the leaves at any line. She read Mr. Stanger's summary at the back at the last quarter of the hour, in which he set forth in 8 sober sentences the legal sufficiency of the 4 sworn instruments to undo the slander of 1817 entire. At 3:45, she closed the portfolio at the brass clasp. She set her gloved hand for a moment upon the cover. She drew it across the cloth to the centre of the parlour table, and across again to her husband's side, and laid it candidly at his elbow. Stainforth. I have read them. The Duke inclined his head once. He did not lift the portfolio. He set his right hand at the rim of the parlour table beside it, and spoke. Adelaide, I am not asking you to return to Stainforth Hall. I shall not press you upon that question at any hour at all until you shall yourself name the day. I am asking you for 2 things at the present interview. First, your forgiveness, at your own terms, at your own time, and with no condition of mine attached. Second, that you shall permit me to call at the parsonage every Wednesday at 3 o'clock through the winter quarter and through Lent, Miss Carr to be at the parlour throughout. I shall not, at the present hour, ask the name of the child. He waited. He did not lift his dish of tea. The fire at the parlour hearth moved at the sedate red. The parsonage clock struck the 3/4. Adelaide sat at the upright Yorkshire chair at the parlour table without movement. She did not lift her sea-green eyes above his cravat. Her gloved hands at the rim of the linen cloth did not stir. She took the thoughtful pause she had taken at the writing table at the dawn of the 17th, the candid Wenningfold pause of 2 unhurried minutes by the customary parsonage measure, and at the close of it she returned candidly to her husband. Stainforth. The forgiveness shall come in its time, on the candid terms I shall name, when I have looked at the affidavits a second time. The Wednesday call shall be permitted at the parsonage parlour, at the chaperonage of my aunt Miss Carr, from 3 o'clock until 5. The child shall be at the nursery throughout the first 3 calls. The Duke inclined his head once at the close. I acquiesce, Adelaide, at your terms and at your hours entire. He set his hand at the rim of the parlour table beside the portfolio. He lifted the dish of tea for the first time, sipped once, and set it again upon the saucer. He did not speak further. Miss Tabitha at the corner, her hazel eyes upon the linen at her sewing frame, did not lift her head. At 4 o'clock, by the parsonage clock, the Duke rose from the further side of the parlour table. He took up the leather portfolio under his right arm. He inclined once at Miss Tabitha at the corner. He inclined deeper at Adelaide, at the upright chair at the south side. He turned for the parlour door. It was at the turning, at 4 exactly, that the open parlour door framed the figure of Sally Gough at the parsonage hall with Master Caspian Halifax in her arms. The child had wakened at the nursery at the 3:45 by his customary afternoon waking. Sally had brought him down by the back stair and had paused at the closed parlour door, by Adelaide's particular instruction, until the parlour clock should strike. At the stroke, she had drawn the door, judicious, unruffled, and stood with the child at her hip at the threshold. Master Caspian Halifax was at his 18 months and 25 days. He was in his unadorned cream linen long petticoats, with the bone buttons of his Sunday coat lately undone at the nursery, his pale blonde fine hair smoothed at the crown, his candid dark jade eyes, uncommon dark sea jade, the colour of the Heir in November, wide upon the parlour. The child saw the man at the parlour table. The man saw the child. Neither spoke. The Duke had paused at the half-step toward the door. His left hand was at his side, his right hand at the rim of the parlour table, the very rim against which the leather portfolio had sat at the hour entire, whitened at the knuckle to the bone of the second joint. He did not lift the hand. He did not move. He did not speak. The dark walnut hair at the temple did not stir. The candid dark jade eyes, his own, his father's, his son's, were upon his son. Master Caspian Halifax, at Sally's hip at the threshold, looked at the man for the deliberate 4 seconds in which a child of 18 months will take in a candid face. He did not laugh. He did not reach. He looked. Adelaide rose from the upright chair at the 5th second. She crossed the parlour rug at the unruffled, candid pace of the parsonage hearth, her dove-grey wool sober at her ankle, the white lawn fichu at her throat unmoving. She came up to Sally at the threshold. She took Master Caspian Halifax from the housemaid's arms into her own, settled him candidly at her own hip, and turned at the threshold to her husband. She inclined her grey-capped head once. The Duke, at the further side of the parlour table, inclined his head deeper. He did not lift his right hand from the rim. He did not lift his eyes from his son at his Duchess's hip. He held the inclination for the full deliberate Stainforth count. He came round the parlour table at the unruffled pace of his own great hall. He passed the threshold at his wife's right. He did not reach for the child. He did not speak. He inclined once more at the front door, at Sally Gough, at Miss Tabitha now risen at the hearth, at Adelaide and the child at the threshold, and walked the flagged path to the gate. Mr. Lockstone, who had stayed at the hall the hour entire, inclined his white head once at his Duchess and at the child at her hip in the candid, sober Stainforth manner, and followed his master at 3 paces. The hired York post-chaise drew off at 5 minutes past 4, the wheels sounding twice on the frost of the parish lane, and ceased at the turn to the Tadcaster Road. Adelaide remained at the open front door, Master Caspian Halifax at her left hip, his fine, pale blonde head against the white lawn fichu at her throat. She did not weep. The Yorkshire dusk had begun to come down at the leafless rowan, the cold blue of the upper sky going at the west to a sedate gold above the moor. She watched the chaise to the turn. She drew the door to behind her at the candid Yorkshire dusk and laid her gloved hand upon the brass latch at its close. "Sally, the fire at the parlour hearth, if you will. Aunt Tabitha shall take the dish of tea afresh." She carried Master Caspian Halifax through the hall to the parlour, and set him candidly at the rug at the hearth at Miss Tabitha's feet, beside Mrs. Beck, the soft grey cat of the village. The leather portfolio was gone from the parlour table. The 4 dishes of tea sat at the 4 sides of the cloth, as they had sat at 3. The fire moved at a sedate red, without sound. Wednesday, the 22nd of December, 1819, came in with a thin frost over the hawthorn at the parsonage gate. Miss Tabitha Carr had set the parlour by 2:30, the tea-things laid, the upright chair at the parlour table drawn for the Duke, her own sewing-frame at the corner. Master Caspian Halifax had been taken upstairs to the north-east nursery for his afternoon sleep by Sally Gough at the customary hour. Adelaide, in unadorned dove-grey wool with the white linen collar, was at the parsonage hearth when the hired York post-chaise drew up at 3. Mr. Lockstone alighted from the rumble, opened the chaise door to his master, and inclined to Miss Tabitha at the parlour window with the sober dignity of his 35 Stainforth years. The Duke of Stainforth came up the flagged path in his unadorned dark walnut travelling coat, his hat in his right hand. Miss Tabitha received him at the parlour door and showed him to the parlour table. He inclined deeply to Adelaide. She acknowledged the inclination with the sedate dignity of a hostess. They sat, the parlour table of Yorkshire oak between them, Miss Tabitha at her corner with the sewing-frame already taken up. For a long minute neither spoke. Then Adelaide ventured, in the candid, sober voice she had used to him at the Sunday call, "My lord, you remarked at the close of the last call, to hear from me the account of the night of the 17th of December, 1817, in such particulars as I am able to give. I am willing, if you are willing to listen, to take you through the hour from the 9:30 to the 10:30. He inclined once. "I am willing, Adelaide. I shall not interrupt." She gathered her hands upon the parlour table. She began. She had been at the south drawing-room with her embroidery frame at the 8 o'clock hour, the household supper having been taken at 7. The long case clock at the foot of the great stair had struck the 9:30. Mr. Lockstone had come to her at the drawing-room door. His lordship desired her presence in the great hall. The Duke listened without movement. His right hand rested upon the Yorkshire oak, the falcon and sheaf signet sober at his finger. She had gone into the great hall by the south corridor. The hall fire had been banked. He had been at the south door, the door open behind him, the sleet driving past his left shoulder, the slanderous letter of his cousin in his right hand. He had not, at that moment, seen her face in the candlelight. He had spoken to her, she observed candidly, with the sober voice of a husband convicted of a wife's infidelity. He had asked her to leave Stainforth Hall by the 10:30 and never to return. Here she paused. She inquired whether he wished her to give the verbatim sentences as she remembered them. "I would be grateful," he answered, very low. She gave them. She gave them sedately, without weeping. She gave them as she had given them in the green-marbled commonplace book of her late mother 5 days before, in the candid italic hand she had used at the dawn. At one juncture in her recital, when she had come to the 4 sober minutes he had given her at the south door, the Duke's right hand upon the parlour table tightened. The signet pressed deeper at the candid Yorkshire oak. The knuckle whitened. The whole hand closed into a shut fist upon the wood. Adelaide observed it. She did not remark. She went on. She had not told him at the 9:30 of that Wednesday night that she was carrying his heir of 3 months and 1 week. She had not told him, because she had not, in the 4 sober minutes he had given her, the means to make the telling believed. She had gone up to her chamber. The undermaid had packed her linen case. At the 10:30 exactly she had gone out at the south door. The sleet had been thick. She had walked the 7 miles to the Skipton Road in her travelling cloak and pattens. The mail coach had passed at the 11 o'clock hour. The 4 shillings to the driver had been paid out of her late mother's locket. At the 11 she had taken the seat to York. She fell silent. The fire at the parsonage hearth gave a low, settled sound. Miss Tabitha at her corner did not lift her eyes from the sewing. The Duke of Stainforth did not speak for the duration of a long minute. Then he unclosed his right hand upon the parlour table. He spread it sober. He inclined his head. He observed at last, very low, "Adelaide, I am grateful for the account. I shall not press you for any further particular at the present hour." She acquiesced. She inclined. They sat through the rest of the 2 hours at the parlour table. Miss Tabitha poured tea at 4. The Duke took his tea in unruffled gravity. He did not, at any moment, raise his voice above the sober register of a husband listening to a recital he had no right to interrupt. At 5, he rose. He inclined to Miss Tabitha and deeper to Adelaide. He went out to the chaise. Mr. Lockstone closed the door. The chaise turned at the village green and went up the Tadcaster Road. Miss Tabitha, candidly, ventured at last, "My dear, you did well." Adelaide acknowledged it. She rose and went up to the nursery to take the boy from Sally Gough for his evening hour. Wednesday the 29th of December came in with the first true snow of the winter upon the moor. The Duke arrived by hired chaise at 3 exactly. Miss Tabitha received him at the parlour door. Adelaide at the parlour table. Master Caspian Halifax upstairs at the nursery in his afternoon sleep. They spoke that day of the early months of 1818. Adelaide, candidly, took him through the 18th of December, her arrival at the parsonage at the 8 o'clock hour of the morning, her aunt's unruffled welcome at the door, the cup of warm milk Miss Tabitha had set before her at 8:30. She gave him her recollection of the mail-coach journey from the Skipton Road at the 11 of the previous night to the York coaching inn at the 7 of the morning, and the hired farm cart from York to Wenningfold at 7:30. She gave him her recollection of the early weeks of January 1818, the unobserved condition. She had not herself perceived it until the 2nd week of January, the storm and the journey having put all such observation aside. The candid conversation with her aunt at the parlour fire on the evening of the 11th. Her aunt's sensible counsel that they should send for the village midwife the following day. The Duke inquired at this juncture after the midwife's name. Adelaide gave it candidly. "Mrs. Bywater of Wenningfold near York, my lord. She has held the office of village midwife these 19 years. She came to me at the parsonage at the 11 o'clock hour of the 12th of January 1818. She was unruffled and judicious. She attended me through the 7 months that followed, and at the boy's birth at the 8 o'clock hour of the morning of the 24th of June. He inclined. He observed at last, "I am grateful. I shall not forget the name." The Duke had brought up to her, in a folded paper at his coat pocket, the candid, grateful note of his sister Lady Eugenia from Beaufort Park. He gave it to her at the close of the second hour. Adelaide read it at her own pace. Miss Tabitha poured tea at 4. The Duke went out at 5. Wednesday the 5th of January, 1820. The third Wednesday call, the frost had thickened on the hawthorn at the parsonage gate. The parlour fire had been built up by Sally Goff at 2:30. Miss Tabitha at her corner with the sewing. Adelaide in unadorned dove-grey wool at the parlour table, the Duke at the upright chair opposite. They spoke for the first hour of the parish charities. The reading class Adelaide had taken at £8 the year by Reverend Bramwell's customary arrangement, the 4 widows to whom Miss Tabitha distributed the late Reverend Carr's coal money at the New Year, the still-room receipts for the winter cordial. Adelaide and her aunt prepared each Michaelmas for the sick of the parish. At 4:45, Sally Goff brought the boy down. Master Caspian Halifax had been waked from his afternoon sleep at 4:30. He was in unadorned cream linen long petticoats with the white linen pinafore Sally had set him in for the call. His candid, dark jade eyes, the eyes of his father, very direct, were upon the man at the parlour table from the threshold. Sally Goff set him at the parlour rug at the hearthside. For a long moment the boy did not move. He looked at the man at the parlour table. The man looked back at him in unruffled, candid gravity. Neither spoke. Then the boy began to toddle. With his still uncertain new walk, his right hand outstretched at the air for balance, he came across the parsonage parlour rug to the man at the parlour table. He stopped at the man's knee. He put his right hand upon the dark walnut wool of the travelling coat at the knee. He looked up. He said, candidly, and so that all 3 persons in the parlour heard it, "Papa." It was his only sober new word of the present month. The Duke of Stainforth did not speak. In unruffled, candid gravity, he set his right hand sober upon the boy's right hand at his knee. The signet of the falcon and the sheaf rested above the boy's pale blonde knuckle. The man and the child remained there at the parlour table edge for the customary half-minute. Adelaide turned at the parsonage hearth. The fire was at low red ember. Miss Tabitha at her corner had set down the sewing. The parlour clock at the chimney-piece gave the 4:30. Then the Duke inclined his head once. He lifted the child gently to his lap. He drew from the inner pocket of his travelling coat the little wooden Stainforth horse, the carved oak horse Mr. Lockstone had sent up to him that morning by the early post, the harness picked out in the Stainforth blue and gold, and the falcon and sheaf at the saddle-cloth. He set it upon the parlour table before the boy. For the next 10 minutes, Master Caspian Halifax sat at his father's lap at the parlour table edge and pushed the little wooden horse across the Yorkshire oak with both hands. He made the horse noise that Sally Goff had taught him at the nursery rocking horse. The Duke held him sober at the waist with the left hand and watched the horse upon the wood. The Duke did not speak through the 10 minutes. The boy did not say the word again. At 5:15, 5 minutes past the customary closing hour, the Duke lifted the boy from his lap and gave him back to Sally Goff at the parlour door. He inclined to Miss Tabitha and deeper to Adelaide. He went out to the chaise. Mr. Lockstone closed the door. The chaise turned at the village green and went up the Tadcaster Road. Miss Tabitha rose from her corner. She went over to her niece and pressed her hand once. "My dear," Adelaide acquiesced. She did not weep. She took the boy from Sally Goff and carried him upstairs to the nursery for his evening porridge. The Wednesday calls continued through January and February at 3 to 5. From the 4th Wednesday, the 12th of January, Master Caspian Halifax was brought into the parlour for the second hour. The Duke and the boy at the parsonage hearthrug, at the little wooden Stainforth horse for the half-hour of each call. Miss Tabitha at her corner with the sewing, Adelaide at the parlour table with her own work or her reading. The boy called the man Papa. Candidly and without hesitation, by the end of January, he had taken up the new word at the second Wednesday on which he had been brought down to the parlour. The Duke acknowledged it sober each time, in unruffled, candid gravity, and never asked Adelaide what the boy ought to call him. Adelaide did not remark upon it. Saturday the 19th of February, 1820, the early Lent fortnight. Lady Eugenia Beaufort and Sir Wilfrid Beaufort had come over from Beaufort Park, 20 miles to the south in the Vale of York. They had set up at the Black Swan at York the previous evening and rode out to Wenningfold at 1 o'clock. They came to the parsonage gate at 3. Adelaide had been at the parlour hearth in unadorned dove-grey wool from 2:45. Master Caspian Halifax at her side, at the hearth-rug, at his little wooden Stainforth horse. Miss Tabitha at the corner with her sewing. Lady Eugenia Beaufort, 34, in her unadorned dove-grey silk morning gown, with the white lace fichu and the fine white lace morning cap pinned over her dark walnut hair, was first at the parsonage door. Her sensible dark jade eyes, her brother's eyes, were upon Miss Tabitha at the threshold. Miss Tabitha inclined gravely and showed her ladyship to the parlour. Sir Wilfrid Beaufort, 40, sturdy at 5'10" in his unadorned moss-green coat, his soft mid-brown hair just brushing the collar, and his kind blue-grey eyes considerate at his wife's shoulder, came in candidly behind her. Lady Eugenia entered the parlour ahead of her husband. She saw Adelaide at the hearth in the unadorned dove-grey wool. She stopped at the door. Her amiable mouth shut once. Her dark jade eyes filled. She wept once at the recognition, a single sober tear upon the right cheek which she touched away with her gloved finger. Adelaide did not weep. She came across the parsonage parlour to her sister-in-law. She inclined. Lady Eugenia candidly observed, "Adelaide, I am to be your sister again at any hour you shall name." Adelaide, in unruffled gravity, answered, "Eugenia, you are my sister at this hour." They took each other's hands at the parsonage hearth. Master Caspian Halifax, at his little wooden Stainforth horse, at the hearth-rug, looked up at the lace morning cap and the kind face above him, and held out his arms candidly. Sir Wilfrid Beaufort inclined behind his wife to Adelaide. "My dear sister, I am yours candidly, at any office that may serve you." Adelaide acknowledged it. "Sir Wilfrid, I am grateful." The Duke of Stainforth had come up by hired chaise at 3 exactly. He stood at the parlour door at his sister's shoulder. He inclined to his wife at the parsonage hearth. He inclined to Miss Tabitha at the corner. He did not, at this hour of the recognition, advance further. Lady Eugenia released her sister-in-law's hands and turned to the boy at the hearth-rug. She knelt sober at the rug in her unadorned dove-grey silk. Master Caspian Halifax permitted himself to be taken up. Lady Eugenia gathered him to her lap at the hearth-chair and gave him a sober kiss at the parting of his pale blonde hair. Miss Tabitha poured tea at 4. The 5 of them, Lady Eugenia at the hearth-chair with the boy at her lap, Sir Wilfrid at her shoulder, the Duke at the upright chair opposite Adelaide, Miss Tabitha at her corner pouring, took tea for the second hour. The conversation was sedate. They spoke of Beaufort Park, of Eugenia's twin daughters Felicity and Frances at 6, of the early Lent at York Minster, of Reverend Bramwell's parish charities. The Beauforts remained at the Black Swan and rode out to Wenningfold each day of the fortnight that followed. Sunday the 20th of February, the morning service at St. Mark's at 10:30, Reverend Bramwell preached the second Sunday of Lent at his customary Yorkshire pace. The Beauforts sat in the rectory pew with Adelaide, Master Caspian Halifax, on Sally Goff's lap at the pew end, and Miss Tabitha at the aisle. The villagers perceived the visitors with the sedate civility owed to gentry come over for the Lent fortnight. After the service, the congregation came out at the south porch. Lady Eugenia, in her unadorned dove-grey silk, came to Sally Goff at the porch and asked candidly to be permitted to hold the child for the moment. Sally gave him up. Lady Eugenia took Master Caspian Halifax into her arms. She kissed him sober upon the pale blonde hair at the parting, in full view of the porch, in the unruffled gravity of an aunt acknowledging a nephew. Reverend Bramwell observed it. He did not yet know the secret of his most discreet parishioner. He perceived, however, that some matter of more weight than usual was in train. He inquired of Miss Carr at the porch in unruffled, gracious gravity. "Miss Carr, I trust the Beaufort family is well. I had not had the pleasure before." Adelaide answered candidly, "Reverend Bramwell, they are well. They are come over for the Lent fortnight. I promise you a fuller account in due course." Reverend Bramwell inclined gravely. He did not press. "Miss Carr, at any hour you shall name." Through the rest of February the Wednesday calls continued. The Duke arrived at 3 by hired York chaise. Miss Tabitha received him at the parlour. Master Caspian Halifax was brought in for the second hour. The Duke and the boy at the parlour hearthrug at the little wooden Stainforth horse for the half-hour of each call. From the Wednesday of the 23rd of February, the Duke and Adelaide began to walk in the parsonage south garden at the close of the call, from 4:15 to the 5 o'clock hour. Miss Tabitha at the parlour window with her sewing observed them sedately at the gravel walk. Sally Goff at the nursery upstairs with Master Caspian Halifax at his afternoon porridge. The conversation in the south garden was of the practical things. The boy's growth. He had taken 3 new words in the past fortnight, and could now ride upon Sally's hip without holding to her shoulder. Adelaide's reading class at the parish school, the new primer Reverend Bramwell had sent up from York, the parish charities, the 4 candid widows, and the winter cordial stock, the hawthorn at the south garden hedge, would bud, Adelaide observed, by the 2nd week of March. They did not, in the south garden walks, speak of the casting-out night. They did not speak of the future. They walked at the candid gravel pace of a husband and wife who have agreed, in unspoken sedate compact, to take only the present afternoon and to let the question of the matter be deferred. Sunday, the 27th of February, 1820, the end of the Lent fortnight at the Beauforts' last Sunday at York, the morning service at St. Mark's at 10:30. Reverend Bramwell preached the 3rd Sunday of Lent, Adelaide in the rectory pew, with Master Caspian Halifax in his Sunday infant coat upon Sally Goff's lap, Miss Tabitha at the aisle, the Beauforts at the next pew, the Duke of Stainforth in the corner of the rectory pew at Adelaide's shoulder. After the service, the congregation came out at the south porch. The Beauforts inclined gracious to the villagers and rode back to the Black Swan at York. Reverend Bramwell inclined to his discreet parishioner at the porch. The Duke walked Adelaide and Master Caspian in his Sunday infant coat upon Sally Goff's hip, back along the south lane from the church to the parsonage. The lane was bordered with leafless hawthorn and the first snowdrops at the lane edge. The pale yellow February sun was at half strength upon the lane. Miss Tabitha had gone ahead. At the parsonage gate the Duke turned to Adelaide. He inclined once, candidly, and said, "Adelaide, might I be permitted to ask you a question of some gravity at the parsonage parlour next Saturday at 3, with Miss Carr present?" Adelaide, in candid self-possession, with her candid sea-green eyes very direct upon her husband's, replied, "My lord, you may." The Duke inclined deeper. He did not speak again. He turned and walked up the south lane to where his hired chaise stood at the village green. Mr. Lockstone at the rumble inclined to his master. The chaise door shut. The chaise turned and went up the Tadcaster Road. Adelaide remained at the parsonage gate for the duration of a long minute. the pale yellow February sun upon the lane, the first snowdrops at the lane edge, the leafless hawthorn at the gate. Sally Gough at her side inclined. "Mistress." "The young master has lately fallen asleep on my hip." Adelaide took the child from Sally Gough. Child. Master Caspian Halifax, lately asleep upon Sally's right hip in his Sunday infant coat, was carried into the parsonage by his mother. She laid him candidly at the parsonage hearthrug to be warmed at the fire before his nursery sleep. Miss Tabitha at the parlour fire set the tea-kettle upon the hob. The fire gave a sober, settled sound. The pale yellow February sun went down at the south parlour casement. The boy slept at the hearthrug. Adelaide knelt sober at the hearthrug beside her son. She set her right hand upon the pale blonde fine hair at his parting. She did not weep. Miss Tabitha at the parlour fire did not remark. The tea-kettle began to sing upon the hob. Tuesday the 29th of February, 1820, came up cold and pale over the moor above the Eyrie, the unbroken light of a late winter morning lying flat upon the south sweep at Stainforth Hall. The leap day, in the candid Yorkshire fashion, was held by the household to be an unlucky day for callers, and Mrs. Tetlow at the housekeeper's room had been heard at the breakfast hour to remark to Mrs. Pinder that no civil caller of any consequence would come up the south sweep on the 29th of any February, to which the calendar gave one. The household at the Hall had risen at the customary 6:30. Mr. Lockstone, who had been 35 years at Stainforth and had witnessed the casting out of the 17th of December, 1817, at the south door in the sleet, had set the morning fires himself at the south library, the morning room, and the breakfast parlour at the 6:30 exactly, and had laid the Duke's London letters at the breakfast parlour writing table at the 7 o'clock hour, with the unruffled gravity of a man who had been holding a private grief for 2 winters, and was unwilling to lay it down at any hour his master had not yet asked him to. The post that morning had brought up nothing of the Wenningfold hand. The Duke had read his 3 London letters at the breakfast table without remark, and he had withdrawn, at the 8 o'clock hour, to the South Library, to write the Wednesday letter to his wife. The Duke was at the South Library at the 10:30, when the south sweep heard, before any servant had been forewarned to expect a caller, the wheels of a hired post-chaise upon the grit of the carriage drive. Mr. Lockstone, at the south door, perceived the chaise to be of the London ranks. A bull-and-mouth hired carriage, mud-splashed at the panels from the 4-day road up the Great North, and he perceived, descending from the off-side step, in a primrose yellow waistcoat under a dark bottle-green wool tailcoat with worn gilt buttons, a gentleman of 49, whose gingery, thinning hair had been oiled forward with insufficient art, whose sallow face was broken at the cheekbones by the fine red veins of the London table, and whose quizzing glass swung on a black silk ribbon at his soft paunch. Mr. Lockstone, who had not seen Sir Octavian Marchmont at Stainforth Hall since the cold October of 1817, inclined gravely at the south door and made no remark whatever. Sir Octavian Marchmont, in his buff pantaloons and his top boots with brass tassels, came up the south steps with the air of a kinsman who supposed himself in the family seat by inheritance unrealized. Medium 5'9" at the soft paunch, faintly out of breath from the 4-day road and from the half-bottle of the bull-and-mouth claret he had drunk at the Tadcaster halt of the day before, he drew off his gloves at the south door with the deliberate ostentation of the quizzing glass. He handed Mr. Lockstone a sealed letter of Furnival's Inn paper, addressed in a clerk's hand to the 5th Duke of Stainforth, and franked at the corner with the wax of a London solicitor unknown at Lincoln's Inn. And he said, in the tone of a man who had not been received at any house of credit in the past 4 months, and was unwilling to admit the fact, that he had come up upon a matter of family concern, which would not, he begged Mr. Lockstone to inform his cousin, suffer postponement. He gave Mr. Lockstone his card with the Marchmont arms upon the corner. He did not. The gravity of Mr. Lockstone's eyes upon him being what it was at the doorway, attempt the further familiarity of the kinsman's hand. Mr. Lockstone bore the letter at the silver salver into the morning-room. He laid it upon the writing-table beside the Duke's untouched coffee-cup. He said only gravely that Sir Octavian Marchmont had arrived from London by hired chaise and waited at the South Hall. The Duke read the letter through once, in the unhurried manner of a man who has been schooled to permit the worst of any sentence to settle before he weighs it. He laid it down upon the writing-table. He asked Mr. Lockstone to send a messenger at once on horseback to York for Mr. Stanger of Lincoln's Inn, who was lodged that week at the Black Swan upon another matter of the Marchmont trusts, and he asked that Sir Octavian be shown into the morning-room at the noon hour exactly, when Mr. Stanger should be in attendance. Mr. Stanger came up from York at 11:30, having ridden the 7 miles of the Tadcaster Road in the cold, pale blue February air, and was shown at once into the South Library, where the Duke laid the Furnival's Inn letter before him without remark. Mr. Stanger, 54, thinning silver-grey hair combed back, grave grey eyes behind the gold-rimmed spectacles, faintly stooped, in unadorned black superfine, read the letter through twice. He set it down. He observed gravely that Mr. Pringle of Furnival's Inn was known to him by reputation as a solicitor of doubtful character whose practice subsisted at the lower margin of the profession, that the new grounds Mr. Pringle advanced were, in their substance, the suggestion that Master Caspian Halifax Marchmont, having been conceived at Stainforth Hall in the autumn of 1817, but born at Wenningfold near York in June 1818, during the lady's exile from the matrimonial home, was on this reading no Marchmont heir male, and ought to be barred from the Stainforth succession in favour of Sir Octavian, and that Mr. Pringle's reading of the law was, in his settled judgment, without foundation whatever. He would, at noon, read aloud the proper Doctors' Commons matrimonial law upon the head, in Sir Octavian's hearing, that no doubt should be left at the morning's conclusion as to the legitimacy of the heir. At 5 minutes before noon, Mr. Lockstone took up his post at the morning-room doorway in his unadorned black butler's tailcoat with the worn silver Stainforth buttons. The Duke entered at noon exactly, in unadorned dark walnut morning coat, the falcon and barley signet upon the right hand. Mr. Stanger took the upright chair at the morning-room writing-table, the Furnival's Inn letter laid open at his elbow, beside a slim morocco book of the matrimonial heads. Sir Octavian was shown in by Mr. Lockstone at the noon hour. He came in with a half-bow that miscarried at the knees, the quizzing-glass swinging at the primrose waistcoat, the lapel of which was faintly stained at a Pall Mall claret drop of some weeks' age. Sir Octavian opened. He spoke at length, in the loose manner of a man who had rehearsed the matter in the hired chaise, without conviction of his text. He laid Mr. Pringle's letter open before the Duke at the morning-room writing-table. He gave the substance of it in his own words, halting once at the second sentence, and once at the fourth, his quizzing-glass at the silk ribbon turning at his fingers in the manner of a London table habit, ill-suited to the unadorned grave mourning of a Yorkshire morning-room. He spoke of the Duchess's residence at Stainforth Hall in the autumn of 1817, and of her removal from the matrimonial home at the storm of the 17th of December of that year. He advanced Mr. Pringle's reading of the period of conception and the place of delivery. He observed, with the suggestion at the corner of his mouth, that he had brought from White's, that the child at the parsonage at Wenningfold had been born of a duchess, who was, at the hour of his birth, no longer in residence at the matrimonial seat. That questions of conception in such cases were, he was advised, not closed by the customary presumptions, and that a gentleman of the Marchmont name had perhaps the right to inquire of the parish register at St. Mark's whether the entry there in his lordship's lady's maiden name might bear some private explanation he had not yet been permitted to hear, he concluded, looking up at his cousin at the writing table with the half-smile of a man who supposed himself to have set out his hand with credit. The Duke's right hand at the writing table closed, once upon the edge of the morocco book, and opened again. He said nothing whatever at the close. Mr. Lockstone, at the doorway, did not move. Mr. Stanger took up the slim morocco book. He read aloud, in the grave, unhurried voice of the Courts of Doctors' Commons, the heads of the matrimonial law as they concerned the legitimacy of issue. That a child conceived during the legitimate marriage of his parents is, by the settled doctrine of the English ecclesiastical and temporal courts, presumed legitimate. That the presumption is not displaced by the parents' subsequent estrangement, by the lady's withdrawal from the matrimonial home, or by the place of the child's eventual delivery. That the presumption is displaced only upon proof of non-access between husband and wife at the period of conception, of which proof Mr. Pringle had advanced nothing whatever, and that the grounds set out in the Furnival's Inn letter were, accordingly, without foundation in the law of England. He closed the book. He returned the Furnival's Inn letter across the writing table to its place at the Duke's right hand. The Duke rose. He spoke once, candidly, in the cold, deliberate pace of a man whose anger had been laid by upon the leash of 2 years' habit, and whose hand at the morocco book had whitened at the knuckle and then ungripped. "Sir Octavian, you have my answer in one sentence. Master Caspian Halifax Marchmont is my legitimate son, born to my Duchess at her aunt's parsonage at Wenningfold near York, at the 8 o'clock hour of the morning of the 24th of June, 1818, and baptized at St. Mark's Parish Church by the Reverend Bramwell at the 4 o'clock hour of the afternoon of the 28th of the same month, by the customary parish register entered there in the candid Yorkshire fashion. He is my acknowledged heir male to the Dukedom of Stainforth as of the present hour, and shall succeed me in due course. You have no claim upon the matter, and you have no right to traduce my son's name in the cause of your own embarrassment at White's. Mr. Lockstone, his lordship is leaving us. Good day." Sir Octavian rose, the colour mounting in patches at his throat above the soiled lapel. He opened his mouth upon some further remark, perceived the Duke's grave eyes upon him without any further word to be given, and shut it again. Mr. Stanger inclined gravely from the writing table. Mr. Lockstone at the doorway drew the door wider with the unhurried hand of a butler who had been 35 years at the Hall and had been waiting 2 of them for this office. He inclined at his master once. He inclined at his master's cousin not at all. He conducted Sir Octavian Marchmont down the south corridor, across the great hall at its pale February light, and out at the south door to the hired chaise at the sweep. He carried Sir Octavian's hat and gloves at the silver salver until the chaise step was let down. He gave them up at the chaise door without remark, the 2-year recollection of the casting out at the south door of December 1817 at last meeting in him its undoing. His master had spoken aloud the vindication Mr. Lockstone had kept within himself for the 24 months of his private grief, and Mr. Lockstone, whose grave grey eyes did not alter at the chaise step, conducted Sir Octavian out with the unruffled gravity of a man whose mind had at length been answered by his master's mouth. The chaise drew off at 20 minutes past noon. Mr. Lockstone watched the wheels to the lodge gate. He returned to the south door. He shut it. The Duke went up from the morning room to the south library at the 12:30. He took the upright morocco chair at the writing table. He drew towards him a fair sheet of foolscap. He set the standish at his right hand. He sharpened his pen with the small steel knife at the writing tray, and he began, in deliberate copper-plate hand, the letter he had to write that hour to Lady Adelaide at the parsonage at Wenningfold. He wrote it sober. He did not attempt the language of the heart. He told her, in candid, grave sentences, of the morning's caller, of Sir Octavian Marchmont's arrival, uninvited by hired chaise from London, of the Furnival's in letter of Mr. Pringle and its substance, of Mr. Stanger's reading aloud of the matrimonial heads of Doctors' Commons, of his own dismissal of his cousin from the morning room at the noon hour, and of Mr. Lockstone's conducting him to the chaise at the South Sweep at 20 minutes past. He set down, candidly, that the slander was without foundation in English law, that he had ridden, that morning, on no other ground than that the news must reach her before any wind of the town carried it up the Tadcaster Road, and that he would, if she would receive him, ride over to Wenningfold himself that evening to lay the matter at her hearth. He enclosed, with the letter, a fair copy in Mr. Stanger's hand of the matrimonial heads, as Mr. Stanger had read them aloud in the morning room, the presumption of legitimacy in the issue of a marriage, the irrelevance of subsequent estrangement, the place of delivery, and the conclusion that Mr. Pringle's grounds were void. He sealed the packet with the Stainforth wax at the writing-table. He gave it at the 2 o'clock hour into Mr. Lockstone's own hand at the south door, asking, gravely, that he carry it himself to Wenningfold by the Stainforth saddle-horse at the 2 o'clock hour exactly. Mr. Lockstone inclined. He took the packet against his coat. He rode out at the South Sweep at 3 minutes past the hour. At 5:30 that evening, the Duke called for the bay hunter at the South Stables. He went out at the 5:30 in his unadorned dark walnut riding-coat over his evening dress, the falcon and barley signet at his right hand under the glove, the cold, pale blue February dusk gathering at the moor above the Heir. He had eaten nothing at the dinner hour the cook had laid for him at the south parlour. He had drunk 1 cup of weak tea at Mrs. Tetlow's hand at the 4:30, and he carried, in the inner pocket of the riding-coat under the unadorned dark walnut cloth, a sealed duplicate of Mr. Stanger's fair copy of the matrimonial heads, against the unlikely event of the morning's packet not having reached the parsonage. He rode the 7 miles to Wenningfold near York at the deliberate pace of a man who had not, that day, the right to ride at any other. The wind from the north-east lay sober at his right cheek. The moor lay open under the dusk. The late winter light at the western horizon was failing at the colour of a kingfisher's wing, and he came down at the parsonage gate at 7:30 exactly, the cold blue light failing at the village lane behind him, the parsonage windows lit at the parlour and the upper nursery. Miss Tabitha Carr received him at the parsonage parlour. 61, iron-grey hair under the clean white linen cap, in her unadorned dove-grey serge with the white lawn fichu, sensible hazel eyes very direct. She opened the parlour door herself at the second knock, gave him her hand gravely at the threshold, and observed, candidly, that Master Caspian Halifax had been carried up to the nursery for the night by Sally Gough at the 7 o'clock hour, and would sleep through, his lordship not having been expected until the Saturday. That Lady Adelaide was at the parlour hearth, and that she, Miss Carr, would sit at the corner with her sewing, as the customary arrangement of the calls required. Adelaide was at the parlour hearth in unadorned dove-grey wool with the clean white linen collar. The fire was at low red ember. The candles upon the parlour writing-table were lit. The letter and Mr. Stanger's fair copy of the matrimonial heads lay open upon the table at her right hand. She had read them, the Duke perceived, more than once. Her hands were folded at her waist. Her sea-green eyes were very direct. She did not weep. She inclined gravely at her husband at the door. The Duke crossed the parlour. He stopped at the parlour rug at 4 paces from the hearth. He gave Miss Tabitha at the corner the grave inclination of a kinsman who knew himself a guest at the parsonage by sufferance and at no other right. He did not take the upright chair at the writing-table that was customarily his at the Wednesday calls. He stood at the rug. He spoke once, gravely, in the deliberate pace he had used at noon in the morning room at the Hall, The heat of the morning's anger lay down at the 7 miles of the moor road in the dusk. Adelaide, I cannot in honour ask you the question I had intended to ask while a slander hangs over our son's name in town. I shall ask when the slander is laid down. Adelaide did not look down at the parlour rug. She did not look at the writing table. She looked at her husband at the hearth in the candid, grave manner she had brought to every Wednesday call of the winter quarter. She answered him, candidly, in the unadorned voice of a woman who had borne 2 Decembers of his absence at her hearth, and was unwilling at the 3rd to fail him by the falter of a syllable. My lord. I shall wait. The Duke inclined gravely. He turned at the rug. He looked at Miss Tabitha at the corner, who had not lifted her eyes from her sewing in the 4 minutes of the exchange, and now did so with her grave hazel gravity, to inform him by her look alone that the parsonage parlour should receive him still upon the Wednesday at 3. He took his leave at the 8:30. Adelaide gave him her hand at the parlour door. He bowed at the threshold. He went out at the south door of the parsonage at the 1:30. The bay hunter at the parsonage gate took him up at the saddle, and he turned the bay's head to the Stainforth road in the cold, pale blue dusk over the moor. He rode the 7 miles back at the deliberate pace he had ridden out by. The cold blue light failed behind him at the village. The moor lay open. The wind from the northeast lay sober at his left cheek now. The falcon and barley signet under the glove rested at the bay's wither at the rein hand. He did not press the hunter to any other gate. The roof line of Stainforth Hall came up at the dark moor at 9:30. Mr. Lockstone met him at the south sweep with the stable lantern. He gave the bay's bridle to the night groom without remark. At the 10:30 that night, the Duke was at the south library writing table. The single trimmed lamp was lit. The low coal fire was banked. He had written, between his return at 9:30 and the 10:30, no other letter than the one he set himself now to write. He drew a fair sheet of foolscap towards him. He set the standish at his right hand. He sharpened his pen. He wrote to his sister Lady Eugenia Beaufort at Beaufort Park in the Vale of York. He told her, in candid, grave sentences, of the morning's caller and his dismissal, of Mr. Pringle's grounds and Mr. Stanger's reading, of the slander upon his son's name, which would, by every London post of the next week, be carried by the unkind mouths at White's into Cavendish Square and Berkeley Square and Grosvenor Square, unless the town side of the matter were set publicly straight by an authority the town would receive. He asked her, gravely, to come up to town with Sir Wilfrid the following week for the Lent fortnight, to call at the customary Marchmont houses of patronage, and to set, in her own gracious, sensible manner, the 3 particulars, straight at Lady Jersey's, the Duchess of Devonshire's, and Lady Sefton's. He did not press her. He acknowledged the inconvenience to her of the spring at Beaufort Park. He set down, candidly, that he was ungoverned in the matter without her. He sealed the letter with the Stainforth wax at the 11:30. He laid it at Mr. Lockstone's salver at the south library door. At the 7 o'clock hour of the Wednesday morning following, Mr. Lockstone himself rode out at the south sweep with the letter under his coat at the inner pocket, the Stainforth express bay at his rein, the cold pale blue dawn lying flat at the moor above the Heir, the 20 miles of the Vale of York road open before him, the south door of Stainforth Hall behind him at the sweep, shut at his going at the unruffled hand of the under-butler, and the unbroken pale blue morning lay flat at the moor above the Heir, and at the southward road to the Vale of York that Mr. Lockstone now rode out upon. Monday the 6th of March 1820 came in upon Beaufort Park in the Vale of York under a soft, pale blue spring sun, and at 9:15, the post-chaise hired out of York for the upward journey to town was drawn up at the south door with 4 horses fresh at the pole. Sir Wilfrid Beaufort, in his unadorned moss-green travelling coat, in the unfussed mode of a Yorkshire gentleman of 40, handed Lady Eugenia Beaufort into the chaise. Lady Eugenia, in her fine dark blue pelisse and her sober straw bonnet, took her seat with the unruffled air of an elder Marchmont sister upon a settled errand. They drove out at 9, came down by Tadcaster and Doncaster to Newark, lay over the Monday night at the Saracen's Head, and went on at 6:30 on the Tuesday morning to Grantham and the Great North Road, south through Stamford and Huntingdon and Ware and Hatfield, putting up at the Marchmont Town House at Cavendish Square on the Wednesday evening, the 8th of March, in time for a late dinner. The town house had been opened by the upper housekeeper, Mrs. Gerard, on the Saturday previous, the holland sheets drawn off and the brass polished in her customary Yorkshire mode. The Lent fortnight at town stretched from the 9th of March to the 24th, 3 weeks at the end of which Lady Eugenia intended to be at the Vale of York again, with her errand done. She had laid out her plan at the South Parlour at Beaufort Park on the Friday previous, in conference with her brother's long, candid letter of the 2nd of March and a fresh memorandum from Mr. Stanger. She would call upon Lady Jersey at Berkeley Square, upon the Duchess of Devonshire at Devonshire House, and upon Lady Sefton at Grosvenor Square. In each of the 3 drawing-rooms, she would set the Marchmont side of the matter publicly straight, and the version put about town by Sir Octavian Marchmont would be contradicted in its 3 particulars, in turn, by a method she had drawn up with judicious deliberation. The first call was made at Berkeley Square on the Wednesday morning of the 9th of March at 11:30. Lady Jersey received Lady Eugenia in her drawing-room with that brisk, amiable curiosity which had made her one of the 7 patronesses of Almack's. She was 49, her glossy chestnut-brown hair drawn smooth beneath a fine lace cap, her sensible, pale-grey eyes very direct, her alabaster-fair, lightly powdered skin set off by the high-waisted, dove-grey silk morning-gown and the white lace fichu at the throat, her slender, 5'7" upright in the chair, the parure of fine pearls catching the morning light. After the customary inquiries, Lady Eugenia observed, with a candid air and her teacup unhurried in her hand, that she was come up to town in particular to lay before 3 or 4 old friends the truth of a vexatious matter concerning her brother's household at Stainforth Hall. She unfolded it without heat, the slanders put about town, these many months by Sir Octavian Marchmont, touching upon her brother the Duke and her sister-in-law, the Duchess, were, in their 3 particulars, without foundation. Sir Octavian's drunken confession at White's in the October of 1819 was now upon affidavit at Mr. Stanger's chambers at Lincoln's Inn, sworn by Lady Eugenia herself, and witnessed by 2 further gentlemen of unimpeached character. Captain Wycombe of the 33rd, who had assisted Sir Octavian at the forging of his evidence in the autumn of 1817, had sent his letter of confession from Lisbon under safe conduct in the November following, the letter now also at Mr. Stanger's chambers in the original. Any imputation upon the late events at Stainforth Hall, founded upon Sir Octavian's testimony, was a contradiction of the affidavit Sir Octavian himself had given upon his own drunken word, and of the Lisbon letter Captain Wycombe had signed under safe conduct, and neither could be contradicted in a Berkeley Square drawing-room upon the further report of the same gentleman at the Pall Mall hazard tables. Lady Jersey, who was no fool and had known the late 4th Duke at her girlhood, set down her cup and answered with the briskness of one accustomed to settle reputations across a tea-table that she would carry the particular into Almack's that very week. She inquired whether Mr. Stanger's chambers would be at the disposal of any gentleman who chose to read the affidavit. Lady Eugenia replied in the affirmative. Lady Jersey observed that she would direct her own brother-in-law's solicitor to call there on the Friday morning. Lady Eugenia acceded with a candid expression of gratitude, Lady Jersey acquiescing gracefully at the drawing-room door. The second call was made at Devonshire House on the Friday following, the 11th of March, at noon. The Duchess, gracious and discerning, heard out the second particular over a fresh dish of Heir. Master Caspian Halifax Marchmont, Lady Eugenia observed in her candid, sober voice, was the legitimate first-born son and acknowledged heir male of her brother the Duke, born to the Duchess at her Aunt Miss Carr's parsonage at Wenningfold near York at the 8 o'clock hour of the morning of the 24th of June, 1818, and baptised at St. Mark's Parish Church, there by the Reverend Bramwell, on the 28th of the same month. The child had been conceived during the legitimate marriage at Stainforth Hall in the September of 1817, 3 months and 1 week before the Duchess withdrew to Wenningfold, and Mr. Stanger's reading of the Doctors' Commons matrimonial law upon legitimacy was that a child so conceived was, in English law, presumed legitimate without further inquiry, the subsequent estrangement of the parents having no bearing whatever upon the issue. Any imputation upon the boy's name was a contradiction of the Doctors' Commons law of the realm, and the Doctors' Commons was not to be contradicted by a Furnival's inn-solicitor of doubtful character upon the retainer of a gentleman at the Pall Mall hazard tables. The Duchess, who had a sober regard for the established Yorkshire families from her late mother's connection at Chatsworth, observed that she would mention it at her Sunday dinner. Lady Eugenia, gratified, observed that the Marchmont family would consider itself much in her Grace's obligation, and the Duchess replied that the obligation was not properly hers to confer, as the late fourth Duke had been a man for whom her own father had borne an established regard, and the matter ought to have been laid down by the gentlemen of his own clubs without the necessity of a sister's calls in Mayfair. The Duchess acquiesced gracefully at the drawing-room door. The third call was made at Grosvenor Square on the Wednesday of the second week, the 16th of March, at 11:30. Lady Sefton, gravely amiable in her drawing-room, received Lady Eugenia with that gracious, unhurried attention which was her customary manner with the elder sisters of the northern peerages, and was given the third particular, the Duchess's own 2 years at Wenningfold. She had been resident throughout the 2 years past at the parsonage under the cousinly fiction of Miss Adelaide Carr, the late Reverend Carr's niece widowed of an army officer husband at Quatre Bras, by the candid, sober kindness of her late mother's elder sister, Miss Tabitha Carr, who had held the parsonage on remainder lease at £15 a year from the present incumbent, Reverend Bramwell, since her brother's death in 1815. The village knew her by no other name. She had given the parish reading class at £8 a year by Reverend Bramwell's customary arrangement. She had been received with judicious kindness by the village as a widow of the customary Yorkshire mode. Any imputation upon a lady of that description was an imputation a gentleman of any decency would be ashamed to put about. Lady Sefton, sensible and well judged in her drawing-room as in all her offices, acceded gracefully, and remarked that she had been put out by Sir Octavian's manner at her last Friday assembly, and would not regret being out to him for the remainder of the season. She added that she had been at York in the summer of 1814, and had a recollection of the late Reverend Carr at the Minster precincts. Lady Eugenia inclined her head and rose to take her leave, Lady Sefton acquiescing gracefully at the drawing-room door. Within 15 days, the 3 drawing-rooms had done their office, and by the end of March the consequences were felt at the Pall Mall houses. Sir Octavian Marchmont was found unwelcome at his usual table at White's on the Tuesday of the last week of March, his name having been spoken of with displeasure at 3 separate club tables on the Monday evening previous. By the second week of April, he had retired from town and taken refuge at a friend's house at Bath for the rest of the spring. Mr. Stanger's separate inquiry, communicated to Lord Stainforth by long private letter dated the 22nd of March, gave the matter its further particulars. Sir Octavian had gambling debts of £6,400 at the Pall Mall houses, the largest a single bond of £2,200 owed to Mr. Crockford at the new house lately set up in Pall Mall, the remainder dispersed among 3 other establishments. His Furnival's Inn solicitor, Mr. Pringle, could not file the legitimacy challenge against Master Caspian Halifax without a retainer of 50 guineas, and the 50 guineas had been refused him at 4 sponsor houses in town, refused, in each instance, upon Lady Eugenia's prior information given in the 3 drawing-rooms. The challenge, Mr. Stanger observed in his careful Lincoln's Inn hand, could not in the present posture of affairs be brought, and his lordship might consider the threat upon Master Caspian's legitimacy as suspended. While these matters were going forward in town, the parsonage at Wenningfold kept its established rhythm through March and April. The Wednesday calls continued at 3 of the clock at the parsonage parlour, with Miss Tabitha Carr at the corner with her sewing. Lord Stainforth came down by his bay gelding from the Black Swan at York. The parlour tea was set out at the half-hour by Sally Gough under Miss Tabitha's direction. The 3 hours from 3 to 6 passed at the unhurried pace the Duchess had set down at the first Sunday call of the 19th of December previous. Master Caspian Halifax, now in the 3rd week of March, 21 months, had come into his father's regard with the candid certainty of a child whose new walk and new speech had been set at the parsonage hearthrug at the half-hours of January and February. He called his father plainly, Papa, upon the threshold of the parlour at 3 of the clock of every Wednesday. He asked at every call, in the unfaltering English of a child who had begun his sentences at 20 months, to be carried upon his father's hip about the parsonage south garden in the warming spring sun. The Duke acceded at every call. He set down his hat upon the parlour table, took off his travelling coat, took up the boy upon his right hip, with the practised right arm of a man who had done it a dozen Wednesdays, and went out at the south door to the gravel path of the garden. Adelaide did not interfere. She remained at the parlour with Miss Tabitha at the corner, and watched the man and the boy from the south window in unruffled, candid gravity. The Duke named for the boy at his own pointing the daffodil and the primrose and the early hyacinth at the south border. The boy laughed at the bee that came up from the wallflowers at the warm middle hour, and the Duke laughed in return, a low and infrequent laugh he had not used in 3 years. And Adelaide at the parlour window observed the laugh and set her unruffled hand against the leaded mullion. Adelaide's half-mourning had eased a further degree with the warming of the season. By the 2nd Wednesday of April, she had laid aside the unadorned dove-grey wool of the parsonage winter, which she had worn without alteration since her removal to Wenningfold in the December of 1817, and had taken to the candid, unadorned cream and sage sprigged muslin morning gown of her late mother's, a gown of 1814, of an unfussed Yorkshire pattern from a length of York muslin Lady Mehitabel had bought at the assemblies of that spring, that she had kept folded at the press these 2 years past. Miss Tabitha had brought it down on the Monday evening previous, and aired it before the kitchen fire. Adelaide met her husband at the parlour door at 3 of the clock in the cream and sage muslin, with the clean white linen collar at the throat, and the simple jet and pearl mourning brooch at the bodice. The Duke, in unruffled, candid gravity, inclined deeply at the lightening of the half-mourning, and remarked nothing of it during the call. At the south gate, at the 6:30, he observed with that judicious, amiable air, which was his customary mode, that the muslin became her in the unadorned Yorkshire fashion her own late mother would have wished. Adelaide, in candid self-possession, answered that her mother had always preferred the unadorned village fashion. The Duke inclined, set his hat upon his head, and rode back to the Black Swan at York. Sunday the 23rd of April. 1820 came in upon Wenningfold under a soft, pale blue April sun, and at the 10:30 the parish bells of St. Mark's rang the village down to morning service. Adelaide walked up at 20 minutes before the hour in the cream and sage muslin under a fresh, dark blue spring pelisse and a sober straw bonnet, Master Caspian Halifax, on Sally Goff's hip in his Sunday infant coat of unadorned cream linen, Miss Tabitha at her left, in her dove-grey serge. They took the rectory pew at the south aisle as they had taken it these 2 years past. Reverend Bramwell, at the chancel, read the third Easter service in his gentle, unhurried Yorkshire voice. At the close of the morning service, Adelaide gave Master Caspian into Sally Goff's keeping and asked Miss Tabitha to walk the boy down to the parsonage with the housemaid in the warm, pale sun. She remained at the south porch and waited for the Reverend Bramwell to come out at his customary minute past the close. She took him aside in the shade of the porch at the south wall. She told him, in her own candid, unhurried voice, and without any preface of apology, the truth of the 2 years past, that she was the 5th Duchess of Stainforth née Templeton Carr, married to Caspian Marchmont, the 5th Duke, at the family chapel of Stainforth Hall on the 8th of June, 1816, that she had been cast out on the storm night of the 17th of December, 1817, upon the false slander of Sir Octavian Marchmont and Captain Wykeham, that she had been received at the parsonage by her aunt under the cousinly fiction of Miss Adelaide Carr, that Master Caspian Halifax was the legitimate first-born son of the Duke of Stainforth, baptized at St. Mark's in her maiden name at her own asking, that the slander had been undone in the October of 1819 by Lady Eugenia Beaufort's overhearing of Sir Octavian's drunken confession at White's, and that her husband had been calling at the parsonage every Wednesday since the 22nd of December, last in pursuance of his amends. Reverend Bramwell received the candid account in his unruffled clerical gravity. He had not, in the 2 years she had sat at his rectory pew, judged. He inclined gently at the close, set his hand upon the porch lintel, and answered in his gentle Yorkshire voice. He had given the boy, he observed, his own first baptism in the candid Yorkshire fashion of the parish, as the child of a widow at the rectory pew of his church, and the boy was sealed thereby into the household of Christ at the proper parish register without distinction of rank, and he should give the boy, on his lordship's particular wish, his proper Stainforth christening at the family chapel of Stainforth Hall on a Sunday in June, at the customary parish licence under the faculty of the Archbishop of York. He had nothing further, he said, to remark. Adelaide, in unruffled, candid gratitude, took the Reverend Bramwell's hand at the porch and thanked him in a voice she had not raised in 2 years. The Reverend Bramwell inclined gently, set his hand once upon her sleeve, and returned to the vestry. Adelaide walked down the south lane to the parsonage in the warm April sun and gave the account of the porch conversation to Miss Tabitha at the half-hour after 12. Adelaide, in unruffled, candid gratitude, took the Reverend Bramwell's hand at the porch and thanked him in a voice she had not raised in 2 years. The Reverend Bramwell inclined gently, set his hand once upon her sleeve, and returned to the vestry. Adelaide walked down the south lane to the parsonage in the warm April sun and gave the account of the porch conversation to Miss Tabitha at the half-hour after 12. Friday the 5th of May, 1820, came in upon Stainforth Hall under the warm, soft blue of the late spring. The Wednesday call of the 3rd of May had been held at the parsonage parlour from 3 to 6. The Duke had ridden up to Stainforth Hall on the Thursday morning. The household had withdrawn to its customary hour by 10:30. Mr. Lockstone had drawn the heavy oak bar across the south door at the established hour. Mrs. Tetlow had been at the housekeeper's room at the 11:15. The long passages had settled into their warm, soft dark by the half-hour after 11. Lord Stainforth came down to the South Library at 1:45 with the green calf leather-bound commonplace book of his late father the 4th Duke Lord Halifax Marchmont under his arm. The book was a tall, narrow volume of 300 pages, bound in dark green calf, the 4th Duke's monogram, blocked into the front board in faded gilt, the inner pages filled for the first 2/3 with the 4th Duke's own copper-plate hand at estate observations, parish memoranda, and household entries from 1781 to his death in 1814. The Duke had taken the book from the South Library shelf in the 3rd week of March, after Mr. Stanger's letter of the 22nd had laid the town slander down, and had laid it upon the writing table with a fresh-cut steel pen and a stoppered ink-pot of Stevens's blue-black, and had not yet written in it. The South Library was a long room of 50 feet by 22, the high oak shelves rising to the moulded cornice in brown gloom, the marble hearth at the east end clean swept of any ash, the south wing chair drawn close at the long polished walnut writing table, the heavy crimson summer curtains drawn back at the south window with the warm, soft dark of the May midnight beyond. Lord Stainforth sat down at the writing table, drew the single brass and green glass lamp toward his right hand, and trimmed the wick with the unhurried care of a man who had trimmed many lamps in many libraries. The lamp burned at his right hand without a flicker. He opened the green calf commonplace book at the first of the unwritten pages. He turned back 2 leaves and read the last entry his late father had made in the September of 1814, an unhurried memorandum upon a sermon preached at the family chapel on the first Sunday of Michaelmas of that year, the 4th Duke's hand at the foot of it, gone a little frail in his last illness, but the copper plate as deliberate as it had been at 40. He turned forward again. He took up the fresh-cut steel pen, dipped it into the Stevens's blue-black, set the nib against the paper at the head of the page, and wrote, in the deliberate copper-plate hand he had been taught at 7 by his late father at this same South Library writing table, 7 candid sentences for the question he would lay before his Duchess at 3 of the clock at the parsonage parlour of Wenningfold near York on the Saturday morning, following in the customary canonical frame of a husband of his rank and his name, upon Lady Adelaide Marchmont, 5th Duchess of Stainforth, née Templeton Carr, only surviving daughter of the late 6th Earl of Kerrowby, and of the late Lady Mehitabel Templeton Carr, née Stanforth, and the mother of his acknowledged son and heir, Master Caspian Halifax Marchmont. He wrote the 7 sentences without erasure or correction. He drew the green calf book toward him, closed it upon the freshly inked page with a sheet of blotting paper laid between, and set it under his right hand upon the writing table. The lamp burned at his elbow without a flicker. Across the long, polished walnut writing table from his own south wing chair, the upright reading chair where Lady Adelaide had sat at the South Library hearthrug as the new Duchess of Stainforth in the September of 1816, the walnut chair of his late mother, Lady Beatrix Marchmont's own selection from the South Library furniture of her 1808, stood empty in the warm, soft dark of the May midnight, the candid afternoon light gone out of it these 3 years and 5 months past. The long fall of the May dark settled upon its turned back as upon the back of an empty pew at the close of a Sunday service. He sat for a further minute at the writing table, his hand resting upon the green calf cover, and then, with the unhurried gravity of a husband who had given his word in the December of 1819 and would keep it on the morrow, he put out the lamp. The Saturday morning of the 6th of May, 1820 came up over the moors above the Heir, under a thin, warm, pale yellow sun. By the 2:30 of the afternoon, the sun had cleared the parsonage hedge at Wenningfold, and laid a band of soft yellow light upon the worn red and brown turkey rug of the parsonage parlour. The parlour fire was at low embers, the long-case clock at the corner ticking sober and unruffled. The parlour table was laid for tea at the Saturday hour with the unadorned blue and white Carr china and the 2-pound seed cake Miss Tabitha Carr had baked at the kitchen range the day before. At the corner chair by the south window, Miss Tabitha sat at her sewing in her unadorned dove-grey serge morning gown with the clean white lawn fichu at her throat, her iron-grey hair beneath the clean white linen cap, her sensible hazel eyes very direct upon her work. At the hearth-rug at the centre of the parlour, Master Caspian Halifax Marchmont, 22 months on the morrow, knelt at his little wooden Stainforth horse upon a pale blue tassel, his fair, fine, pale blonde hair lately come in waves about his forehead, his unadorned cream linen petticoats clean upon him, his candid dark jade eyes, his father's eyes, fixed in absorbed gravity upon the horse's neat painted mane. Adelaide Marchmont, known these 2 years and 4 months at Wenningfold near York, under the cousinly fiction of Miss Adelaide Carr, the late Reverend Carr's young niece, widowed of her army officer husband at Quatre Bras, sat upright at the upright Yorkshire chair by the parlour table in her unadorned dove-grey wool morning gown with the clean white linen collar, her soft mid-blonde hair pinned smooth at the nape under her sober dark cap, her candid sea-green eyes resting upon her son. At 3 o'clock, exactly the hired York post-chaise drew up at the parsonage gate. Mr. Lockstone, white-haired, tall and thin and upright in his unadorned black butler's tailcoat with the worn silver Stainforth buttons, descended from the rumble and inclined at the parsonage south door. Sally Gough opened the door at the candid Yorkshire bob and showed his lordship through. Caspian Marchmont, 5th Duke of Stainforth, came in by the south parlour door in his unadorned dark walnut travelling coat over his judicious morning dress, the 2 threads of pure silver above his right temple, lately come of grief, catching the May afternoon light. His candid grave mouth was sober, his deliberate dark jade eyes, uncommon dark sea jade, the colour of the Heir in November, rested first upon his wife at the upright Yorkshire chair, then upon Miss Tabitha at the corner, then upon the kneeling boy at the hearth-rug. He inclined deeply at Miss Tabitha. He inclined deeper at his wife. He did not, this Saturday afternoon, take the wing-chair to which Adelaide gestured in unruffled gravity. Instead, the Duke of Stainforth crossed the worn Turkey rug, knelt down at the hearth-rug at his son's level, set his right hand sober at the little wooden horse, and looked up, from the kneel, at his wife at her upright Yorkshire chair. "Adelaide," he said, in his sober, candid voice, "I had not. When I cast you out at the storm of the 17th of December, 1817, known what I am asking now to undo, I have loved you, with what dignity I could, and with what slowness the 2 years of your absence required, since the morning of the 8th of June, 1816, at the family chapel of Stainforth Hall. I am asking now, on no other ground than that I have loved you steadily through whatever I did to deserve to lose you, to return to me as my wife in the office, to which I never had the right to remove you, and to bring our son with you. You have been driven from me too long to be expected to love me now. I shall not press you on that. I ask only that you consider the question at your own time, and answer me upon your own terms. If your answer is no, my Wednesday calls at this parsonage shall continue undiminished, while you and our son shall suffer them, and the question shall never be raised again." He laid his hand again at the painted horse. Master Caspian Halifax, who had heard the cadence of his father's voice and had set his own hand upon his father's wrist, looked up in candid puzzlement at the man, then back at the horse. Adelaide did not, at the upright Yorkshire chair, weep. She did not move. The parlour fire ticked softly at the grate. At the corner Miss Tabitha had set down her sewing in her lap, and did not lift her eyes from it. The thoughtful pause was, Adelaide judged afterwards, near a full minute. Her candid sea-green eyes rested first upon her husband at the hearthrug, then upon her son's small fair hand at his father's wrist, then upon the band of warm pale yellow May sun lying along the worn turkey rug. "My lord," she said, in her sober Wenningfold voice, "I shall." The Duke of Stainforth bowed his dark walnut head once at the hearthrug. He did not speak. Master Caspian Halifax, who had grasped, in the candid fashion of his 22 months, that some manner of consequence had passed between the two large people at his left and his right, lifted his hand from his father's wrist, set it upon the painted Stainforth horse, and lifted his candid dark jade eyes at his father's face. "Papa," he said, in his sober dark jade gravity, "garden." The Duke laughed once at the hearthrug, the first laugh Miss Tabitha afterwards observed at her own commonplace book, that had been heard in the parsonage parlour since the casting out of December 1817, and gathered the boy up at his right hip. Master Caspian Halifax leant his fair head upon his father's shoulder in unruffled satisfaction. "My lord," Adelaide said, in the parlour doorway, "the south garden is at the warmest of the sun at this hour." The Duke carried Master Caspian Halifax out at the parsonage south door into the warm pale yellow May afternoon sun, and for the half-hour that followed, Adelaide and Miss Tabitha, at the parsonage south window with the muslin curtain drawn back, watched the tall, upright, dark walnut figure of the 5th Duke of Stainforth walk slow about the parsonage south garden with his son upon his right hip, pausing at the apple tree to set the boy's hand upon the rough, warm grey bark, pausing at the bed of pale May lilac to set a sprig at the boy's fair, pale blonde hair, pausing at the south paling to lift the boy that he might see the lambs at the next pasture. Adelaide did not, at the parsonage south window, weep. Miss Tabitha at her elbow did once, briefly, in unruffled gravity, into her white linen handkerchief, and did not remark upon it. At the 3:30, Sally Gough brought the tea-tray in at the parlour table. The kettle had been kept warm at the kitchen range. Adelaide sat at the upright Yorkshire chair and poured for her aunt, in unruffled gravity, the candid Wenningfold cadence of the parlour, resumed at once as though no question had been asked of any sort that afternoon. When the Duke returned at 4 with Master Caspian Halifax asleep upon his shoulder, the boy's fair, pale blonde hair damp at the brow from the warm May sun, Adelaide took him from her husband at the parlour threshold and carried him up the parsonage stair to the north-east nursery in candid Wenningfold ordinariness. The reading of the banns was set at once. Reverend Wenlock, chaplain to the Marchmont family at the family chapel of Stainforth Hall, presented to that chaplaincy by the late 4th Duke in 1811, rode over to the parsonage at Wenningfold by the Tuesday following, was received at the parlour table at 4 o'clock by Adelaide and Miss Tabitha, and consulted at length with Reverend Bramwell of St. Mark's. The two clergymen, Reverend Wenlock, with his soft, sandy grey hair finely thinning, his sensible blue-grey eyes, his fair, faintly weathered Yorkshire skin, in his unadorned black cassock, his gentle, Marchmont-trained voice, Reverend Bramwell with his soft white hair finely thinning, his sensible grey eyes behind their gold-rimmed spectacles, in his unadorned black cassock, agreed in unruffled judicious gravity at the parsonage parlour fire that the proper form was the reading of banns on 3 successive Sundays at the two churches, the renewal of vows being treated by Reverend Wenlock under the faculty of the Archbishop of York as a reaffirmation of the original sacrament of the 8th of June 1816 at the family chapel of Stainforth Hall, rather than as a new marriage. Mr. Stanger from Lincoln's Inn was written to by the same post. The parish licence was drawn up accordingly at his chambers the following week and sent down by mail coach to Reverend Wenlock at Stainforth Hall. The banns were read at the family chapel of Stainforth Hall by Reverend Wenlock and at St. Mark's at Wenningfold by Reverend Bramwell on the Sundays of the 7th, the 14th, and the 21st of May, 1820. At each reading, the candid, sober formula was given out. I publish the banns of marriage between Caspian Halifax Marchmont, 5th Duke of Stainforth of this parish, and Adelaide Mehitabel Templeton Carr, his wife, of the parish of Wenningfold, near York. If any of you know cause or just impediment why these two persons should not be joined together, ye are to declare it. This is the 1/2/3rd time of asking. And on no Sunday did any voice rise. The parishioners of Wenningfold near York, on the 3rd Sunday, suffered their late Reverend Carr's young niece to walk out of St. Mark's at the noon under the parish lych gate, with their candid Yorkshire goodwill at her shoulder. The renewal of vows was set for the Saturday morning of the 27th of May, 1820, at 10 o'clock at the family chapel of Stainforth Hall. That Saturday morning came up over the moors above the Heir under a warm, clear, pale blue May sky. The family chapel of Stainforth Hall, a sober stone Yorkshire chapel of the late 17th century, set at the south lawn behind the kitchen garden wall, its oak pews polished by 5 generations of Marchmont hands, its narrow lancet windows admitting the warm, clear, pale blue May light at slant bands across the worn slate floor, had been laid out at the dawn by Mrs. Tetlow and Mrs. Pinder. Posies of pale May lilac and cream, May blossom tied with white silk ribbon, hung at every pew end. Upon the simple oak altar, 2 brass candlesticks bore lit beeswax candles, the slim pale flames upright in the unruffled May morning air. Reverend Wenlock waited at the chancel step in his unadorned black cassock with the white linen surplice, his soft, sandy grey hair finely combed, his gentle Marchmont-trained voice already saying its sober, inward preparation. The Duke of Stainforth waited at the chancel step at Reverend Wenlock's right, in unadorned black superfine wedding tailcoat, high white starched cravat, white silk waistcoat with a very faint silver pinstripe, black satin knee breeches, white silk stockings, and buckled black evening shoes. The heavy silver Stainforth ducal signet, a falcon over a sheaf of barley, at his right hand, a sprig of pale May lilac at his lapel. The 2 threads of pure silver above his right temple caught the lancet light. His candid, grave mouth was unruffled. His deliberate, dark jade eyes rested upon the chapel's south door. Sir Wilfrid Beaufort waited at the Duke's left in his unadorned moss-green coat, his sturdy frame upright, his kind blue-grey eyes mild upon his brother-in-law. At the front pew upon the south side, Miss Tabitha Carr sat very upright in her unadorned dove-grey serge morning gown, with the clean white lawn fichu, the iron-grey hair beneath her clean white linen cap, her sensible hazel eyes resting upon Master Caspian Halifax Marchmont, 23 months, 3 days old, upon her lap. The boy wore his unadorned cream linen Stainforth christening coat, lately cut for him by Mrs. Pinder at the housekeeper's parlour the previous Tuesday. His fair, pale blonde hair was combed smooth. His candid, dark jade eyes, his father's, rested in absorbed gravity upon the tall lit beeswax candles at the simple oak altar. At a minute before 10, the chapel south door opened. Mr. Stanger, 54 years old, his thinning silver-grey hair combed back, his grave grey eyes behind the small gold-rimmed spectacles in his unadorned black superfine, gave his right arm at the door. Adelaide Marchmont took it. She came up the slate aisle on Mr. Stanger's arm in her unadorned cream Yorkshire muslin morning gown, made in the simple Wenningfold village, cut by Mrs. Bywater, the village dressmaker, with a sprig of pale May lilac pinned at the bodice in the candid Yorkshire fashion of a Wenningfold bride, long, unadorned ivory silk gloves to the elbow, and her late mother's small, green-marbled commonplace book carried in an unruffled silk reticule at her wrist. Her soft, mid-blonde hair was pinned smooth at the nape under a simple white lace morning cap. Her candid, sea-green eyes rested upon her husband at the chancel step. Lady Eugenia Beaufort followed at 3 paces in her own unadorned dove-grey silk morning gown with white lace fichu. Her dark walnut hair, pinned smooth under a fine white lace morning cap, her sensible dark jade eyes mild upon her sister-in-law's shoulder. The Duke of Stainforth did not, as Adelaide came up the aisle, move from the chancel step. He waited. At the chancel step, Mr. Stanger laid Adelaide's gloved hand sober upon the Duke's right hand and inclined once at Reverend Wenlock. Reverend Wenlock inclined back. Mr. Stanger stepped to the front pew at the north side. Reverend Wenlock opened his prayer book at the marked place and gave out the office of the reaffirmation in his gentle, Marchmont-trained voice. Not the office of a new marriage, but the office of a sober renewing of vows, drawn under the faculty of the Archbishop of York as a reaffirmation of the original sacrament of the 8th of June, 1816, drawn at Mr. Stanger's chambers the previous week, read now at the candid, sober pace of a Yorkshire chaplain. The Duke gave his vows in his sober, candid voice, without a tremor. Adelaide gave hers in the candid Wenningfold cadence she had brought down to that chapel by Mr. Stanger's arm. Neither wept. At the front pew, Master Caspian Halifax, who had not understood any single word of the office, leant his fair, pale blonde head upon Miss Tabitha's shoulder and watched the slim, pale, upright candle flames at the simple oak altar. Reverend Wenlock pronounced the blessing in his gentle, Marchmont-trained voice. The Duke laid Adelaide's hand into the crook of his arm at the chancel step. They came down the aisle at the unruffled, candid pace of a Yorkshire-bred pair, Lady Eugenia and Sir Wilfrid following, Miss Tabitha and Master Caspian Halifax at her hip following, Mr. Stanger at the rear. The wedding breakfast was laid at the long, polished oak refectory table at the south dining-room of Stainforth Hall at 11:30. Mrs. Pinder's tall, white-iced Stainforth wedding cake, drawn from the receipt book of the late 4th Duchess, Lady Beatrix Marchmont née Loveday in Mrs. Pinder's own 30-year hand, was set at the centre of the table beside the silver bowl of pale May lilac. Mr. Lockstone served the breakfast in unruffled gravity, his 63 years upright at the sideboard, his kind grey eyes resting once, at the cutting of the cake, upon the new Duchess at the right of his master. The 2 years and 5 months of his unforgivingness laid down at the silver sideboard at last in candid Yorkshire silence. 15 days after the renewal of vows at the family chapel of Stainforth Hall, on the warm, pale gold Sunday morning of the 11th of June, 1820, their first-born child, Master Caspian Halifax Marchmont, lately turned 2, was formally christened at the family chapel of Stainforth Hall by the Reverend Wenlock, chaplain to the Marchmont family, with Lady Eugenia Beaufort standing as godmother and Sir Wilfrid Beaufort as godfather. The Stainforth family Bible entry was written in the 5th Duke's own hand at the South Library writing table that evening, beside the entry for the renewal of vows of the 27th of May, 1820, and the entry for Master Caspian's first baptism at St. Mark's, Wenningfold near York, by the Reverend Bramwell of the 28th of June, 1818, which his Duchess had asked be set there in the candid Yorkshire fashion of his maiden name infancy. By the Tuesday evening of the 18th of July, 1820, the long Yorkshire summer dusk was coming down at 8:30 over the moors above the Heir, under a warm, pale rose sky. At the South Library of Stainforth Hall, the tall oak shelves rose into a soft brown gloom. The marble chimney-piece bore a low summer fire at the grate. The worn turkey rug lay sober between the two wing chairs drawn close at the hearth. A single trimmed lamp upon the long polished walnut writing table cast its soft yellow circle at the chair where the new Duchess of Stainforth was reading aloud from Cowper's Task. Adelaide Marchmont sat in her own unadorned cream summer muslin morning gown with a clean white lawn fichu at her throat, her soft mid-blonde hair pinned smooth under a fine white lace evening cap, the open green-bound octavo of the Task at her lap. Caspian, in his judicious evening dress, the heavy silver ducal signet at his right hand, sat at the wing-chair opposite, his deliberate dark jade eyes resting upon his wife's face, his candid grave mouth mild at the corner. Master Caspian Halifax was upstairs at the night nursery, asleep upon the small Stainforth cot. Sally Gough, lately come up from the Wenningfold parsonage at the new Duchess's settled arrangement, at the nursery rocking-chair at the candle-end, upon the long polished walnut writing-table, laid open at the entry of the 17th of December, 1819, in Adelaide's own candid italic hand, was the small foolscap octavo, green-marbled commonplace book of the late Lady Mehitabel Templeton Carr, now in the new Duchess of Stainforth's keeping. Miss Tabitha Carr, by the Duke's settled arrangement at the renewal of vows of the 27th of May, 1820, held now her own permanent apartment in the south wing of Stainforth Hall, 2 rooms with a south aspect, a brass bedstead, an upright Yorkshire writing-table, and the worn green baize sewing-stool sent over by the Wenningfold parsonage. She took her tea at the housekeeper's parlour with Mrs. Tetlow at 5 o'clock most afternoons, walked down at 6 to the family chapel for Reverend Wenlock's evening prayer, and read the Yorkshire Gazette aloud at the South Library after dinner on Wednesdays. Adelaide turned the page of Cowper at her lap, and read on in her sober Wenningfold cadence. Caspian at the opposite wing chair did not interrupt. There are stories that begin with a kiss. There are stories that begin with a vow. There are stories that begin with a knock, and stories that begin with a hired post-chaise, and stories that begin with a will, a newspaper notice, a parish ledger, a still-room book receipt, a fresh-cut gravestone, a sailor's last log letter from the West India Station. And there are, sober, longer in the asking, of the most patient deliberation in the forgiving, stories that begin with a young woman of 22, cast out into the sleet at 9:30 of a Wednesday night in the December of 1817, and the candid first-person entry. She set down 2 years to the day at her late mother's green-marbled commonplace book at the parsonage at Wenningfold near York. Stories that go on with the unadorned Stainforth sealed letter that came up to her by the 7 o'clock post of the 17th of December, 1819, and the Sunday call her husband made at 3 o'clock at the parsonage parlour on the 19th of December under the chaperonage of her aunt, Miss Tabitha Carr, and the Wednesday calls he made through the winter quarter and the Lent of 1820 at 3 o'clock until 5, and the candid first toddling word, Papa, their son spoke at the parsonage hearthrug at the 3rd such Wednesday call upon the 5th of January, and the candid asking question her husband knelt to put to her at the parsonage hearthrug at 3 o'clock upon the Saturday afternoon of the 6th of May, and the renewal of vows the Reverend Wenlock pronounced at the family chapel of Stainforth Hall upon the Saturday morning of the 27th of May, and the formal christening of Master Caspian Halifax Marchmont at the family chapel of Stainforth Hall upon the warm, pale gold Sunday morning of the 11th of June, and the sober coda at the South Library, writing table at 8:30 of the 18th of July, 1820. And so, on the warm, pale gold Sunday morning of the 11th of June, 1820, in the family chapel of Stainforth Hall on the moors above the Heir, under the gentle Yorkshire summer sun, Adelaide Marchmont, who had once been the parish schoolmistress at Wenningfold near York, under the cousinly fiction of Miss Adelaide Carr, restored, by the patient candid asking of the 5th Duke of Stainforth, her husband, her son, Master Caspian Halifax Marchmont, to his proper Stainforth name and his proper Stainforth christening at the family chapel of his fathers, in the candid Yorkshire fashion the Marchmonts had kept all their days.